Imagine for a moment a world stripped of its richest flavors and most foundational ideas. A world without the deep, complex taste of chocolate, without the shimmering, luxurious feel of silk against your skin, and without the very concept of the number zero to underpin our mathematics and technology. It's a stark and strangely empty picture, isn't it? Yet, these were not local inventions that sprung up independently in isolated corners of the globe. They were travelers. Each of these essentials journeyed thousands of miles across vast, unforgiving deserts and treacherous, unknown seas, carried along invisible pathways that connected empires and cultures that knew almost nothing of one another. These were the hidden networks of ancient trade, and their story is the secret history of our modern world. This was not mere commerce. It was the circulatory system of human civilization, pumping not just goods, but the very lifeblood of ideas, beliefs, and innovations that would ultimately shape our collective destiny. Today, we are pulling back the curtain on these forgotten pathways. We are going on an epic journey to unveil the hidden networks that stitched the ancient world together. From the legendary Silk Road weaving through towering mountain passes to the daring spice routes that challenged sailors against the fury of the open ocean. We will discover how the simple, primal act of trade, the exchange of one object for another, did so much more than move merchandise. It sparked cultural revolutions, allowing religions and philosophies to cross continents. It accelerated technological advancements, spreading revolutionary inventions like paper and gunpowder. And perhaps most profoundly, it laid the very foundations of globalization, creating the first interconnected economy that linked the fates of farmers in Asia to merchants in Venice and emperors in Africa. This exploration will reveal a truth that might just change how you see everything. Our hyper-connected, globalized world is not a modern invention of the internet age. It is an ancient legacy, a story written in the dust of caravan trails and the salt spray of ancient sea lanes. So prepare to see history in a completely new light. We are about to trace the origins of our global village back to its very earliest roots, to a time when a single trade route could alter the course of human progress forever. This is a story of incredible human ambition, of curiosity that conquered fear, and of connections that bridged seemingly impossible divides. It's a story that proves our world has always been smaller and our destinies more intertwined than we ever could have imagined. Get ready to embark on a journey that will change your understanding of where we came from and how we all became connected. To understand these vast intercontinental networks, we have to go back to their absolute beginning, to a time long before written history, before money, before even the concept of a market. We must look to the very dawn of exchange itself. Picture a scene from deep in our prehistoric past. Two small groups of early humans meet, perhaps at a river crossing or a known hunting ground. There is no common language, no shared culture, but one person holds a piece of obsidian, a volcanic glass that can be chipped into the sharpest blades imaginable. Another holds a string of beautifully polished seashells carried from a distant coast. A look passes between them, a moment of silent recognition. An object is pointed to, a gesture is made, and an exchange occurs. This was not a financial transaction as we know it. This was barter, the world's first and most fundamental economic system. In that simple act of trading obsidian for shells or amber for flint, something monumental happened. The first fragile connection was made. This was the spark. This primal commerce did so much more than just redistribute objects. It created humanity's very first social networks. These exchanges forced communication, however rudimentary. They required a basic level of trust and an understanding of mutual benefit between people who were otherwise strangers. A successful trade meant not only that you acquired a superior tool or a valued ornament, but that you had established a potential ally. You had created a relationship that could be revisited, a pathway that could be walked again. This was trade as survival, as alliance building, as the first step out of isolation. The goods themselves were often deeply practical. The movement of high-quality flint across prehistoric Europe is a perfect example. Flint from particularly rich quarries could travel hundreds of miles from its source. This wasn't just about moving rocks, it was about moving knowledge. With every piece of traded flint came the embedded technique of the person who crafted it. A tribe receiving a beautifully worked flint knife from a distant region wasn't just getting a tool, they were getting a lesson. They could study its shape, its balance, the way the flakes had been struck. In this way, advanced tool-making techniques spread across the continent, accelerating technological progress for everyone involved. This initial, sprawling web of exchange laid down the essential psychological and social groundwork for everything that was to come. It proved that cooperation beyond one's immediate tribe was not just possible, but profoundly beneficial. It cultivated a mindset of curiosity about what lay beyond the horizon, and an understanding that other people possessed valuable things, both tangible and intangible. This foundational impulse to connect, to trade, to share, this is what set the stage. The desire for a seashell from a far-off ocean or a piece of amber that held the sun's glow within it created the momentum that would eventually build the Silk Road, launch the spice ships, and weave the entire ancient world into a single, intricate tapestry of human endeavor. Now, let's zoom in on the first and perhaps most famous of these ancient superhighways, the Silk Road. Its name evokes images of camel caravans laden with shimmering bolts of Chinese silk, and that luxurious fabric was indeed a primary motivator, so coveted by Roman elites that senators complained about the vast sums of gold flowing east to pay for it. But to think of the Silk Road as only a route for silk is to miss its true, world-altering significance. This was not a single, paved road, but a sprawling, messy, and magnificent web of land and sea routes, a network of pathways that stretched for over 4,000 miles, linking the imperial courts of China to the bustling markets of the Mediterranean. It was a highway of humanity, and its caravans carried a cargo far more precious than any single luxury good. They carried the very ingredients of civilization itself. Think of the spices that transformed bland food into culinary art: pepper from India, cinnamon from Sri Lanka. Picture the brilliant glassware crafted in Roman and later Islamic workshops, a technology that was itself a marvel to be traded. These tangible goods were just the surface of a much deeper current of exchange. The most profound transactions happening along the Silk Road were not of things, but of thoughts. This is where belief systems embarked on their greatest journeys. Buddhism, for instance, was born in India, but it was along these dusty tracks that it traveled, step by step, monastery by monastery, into the heart of Central Asia, China, Korea, and Japan. Monks and missionaries walked alongside merchants, and the cave temples of Dunhuang in Western China stand as a breathtaking testament to this fusion, their walls covered in murals that blend Indian, Persian, and Chinese artistic traditions into a unique spiritual language. In the other direction, a revolutionary technology began its westward march. Paper-making, invented in China, was slowly adopted by the Islamic world after the Battle of Tollas in the 8th century, where Chinese papermakers captured as prisoners shared their secret. From there, paper mills sprung up in Baghdad and across the Muslim world, eventually replacing cumbersome parchment and papyrus and paving the way for a revolution in literacy, administration, and scholarship that would later ignite the European Renaissance. The journey of paper is a perfect example of how the Silk Road functioned not as a direct delivery service, but as a relay race of knowledge where each culture passed the baton, adding its own improvements before sending it further along the chain. The infrastructure that made this all possible was as ingenious as the exchanges themselves. Scattered along the routes, sometimes a day's camel ride apart, were the caravanserais. These were not just simple inns, they were fortified way stations, bustling hubs of activity that provided shelter, food, and water for weary travelers and their animals. But their role extended far beyond mere rest. Within those walls, a Sogdian merchant from Samarkand might bargain with a Chinese official in a pidgin tongue, while a Persian artisan displayed his wares to a Turkish nomad. Languages blended, stories were shared, musical instruments were heard and imitated, and recipes were exchanged over shared meals. The caravanserai was a crucible of cultural fusion, a place where the distinct threads of different civilizations were woven together into new and vibrant patterns. The Silk Road, therefore, demonstrates a fundamental truth about human connection. Trade routes are not simply lines on a map for moving merchandise. They are the vital arteries of civilization, pumping not just goods, but the very lifeblood of culture, innovation, and belief across the body of the globe. The legacy of this first great network teaches us that while silk decays and spices are consumed, the ideas that traveled with them, the religious faith, the scientific knowledge, the artistic inspiration, these are the truly valuable and enduring cargo, the invisible wealth that reshaped our world forever. If the Silk Road was the overland network of ideas and luxuries, then the spice routes were its maritime counterpart, a sprawling aquatic web driven by something even more primal and universal, the pursuit of flavor. We often associate the quest for spices with European explorers like Vasco da Gama and Christopher Columbus braving uncharted oceans in the 15th and 16th centuries, but their daring voyages were merely the final, frantic chapters of a story that was already millennia old. Long before a single Portuguese caravel rounded the Cape of Good Hope, the spice routes were a thriving, sophisticated network, a liquid highway connecting the fragrant islands of Southeast Asia, the only place in the world where cloves, nutmeg, and mace grew, to the bustling markets of the Middle East and the eager palates of Europe. This was not a story of European invention, but of their desperate and belated attempt to break into a system that had been perfected by others. The true masters of this maritime world were Arab and Indian merchants. For centuries, they had navigated the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean not by fighting its rhythms but by surrendering to them. They possessed an intimate, almost magical understanding of the monsoon winds. These were not gentle breezes but powerful, seasonal engines of commerce. For 6 months of the year, the winds would blow steadily from the southwest, perfect for sailing from the Arabian Peninsula to the Malabar coast of India or the islands of the East Indies. Then, as if on a cosmic schedule, the winds would reverse, blowing from the northeast for the other 6 months, carrying these same ships, now laden with precious cargo, back home. This predictable, powerful natural force allowed for regular, scheduled voyages across astonishing distances, creating a reliable maritime web that wove together the fortunes of 3 continents. The wealth generated by this trade was almost unimaginable. A single sack of peppercorns could be worth its weight in silver. A handful of cloves could purchase a small plot of land. This immense economic power did not stay at sea. It flowed directly into the stone and mortar of port cities, transforming them into glittering centers of global commerce. Cities like Calicut on India's southwestern coast, Aden at the mouth of the Red Sea, and Malacca in modern-day Malaysia became nerve centers of the known world. In their harbors, ships from a dozen different cultures would bob at anchor, their hulls filled with cinnamon from Sri Lanka, pepper from the Malabar coast, and sandal wood from Timor. The docks were a cacophony of languages: Arabic, Tamil, Malay, Persian, Chinese, as merchants haggled, brokers negotiated, and scribes recorded transactions that would affect prices from Venice to Beijing. Controlling even a small piece of this lucrative flow was the key to empire. The Romans, who adored pepper, poured vast sums of gold and silver into the east to secure it, a drain on their treasury that worried their economists. 1,000 years later, the Venetian Republic built its entire dazzling wealth and power not by producing spices, but by acting as the primary middleman, buying them from Muslim traders in Alexandria, and then selling them at a massive markup to a spice-crazy Europe. The Venetian monopoly was so complete and so envied that it became the primary target for other European powers. It was the desire to bypass the Venetians, to go directly to the source and claim the astronomical profits for themselves, that ultimately provided the financial and political fuel for the Age of Discovery. When Prince Henry, the navigator of Portugal, sent his captains creeping down the coast of Africa, and when Christopher Columbus pitched his wild idea to sail west to reach the east, they were not motivated by pure, abstract curiosity. They were driven by the specific, intoxicating aroma of profit, the dream of finding a direct path to the Spice Islands and breaking the chains of the established trade networks. But to understand why spices held such immense power, we have to look beyond the kitchen. Yes, they transformed bland, preserved foods into delightful meals, but their value was multifaceted and deeply embedded in the fabric of pre-modern life. In an era before refrigeration, spices like pepper, cloves, and cinnamon were vital for food preservation, their antimicrobial properties helping to keep meat edible for longer. They were also the foundation of ancient medicine. Cloves were used to treat toothaches, pepper was thought to aid digestion, and complex spice mixtures were central to the apothecary's art. Perhaps most importantly, spices were a powerful, visible symbol of status and wealth. To serve a feast heavily seasoned with rare, expensive spices was to demonstrate one's sophistication, global connections, and immense purchasing power. A wealthy European noble might literally be worth his weight in pepper. This convergence of practical utility, medicinal belief, and potent social signaling created an economic and social force unlike any other. The hunger for these flavors did far more than just season food. It seasoned the entire course of history, setting nations on a collision course, funding voyages that would accidentally discover new continents, and redrawing the map of the world in the process. The spice routes stand as a monumental testament to a simple, profound truth: that human desire, in this case for something as seemingly minor as a more flavorful meal, is one of the most powerful forces on Earth, a force capable of forging empires and charting the unknown. While the Silk Road and the spice routes connected the sun-drenched civilizations of the East and South, another, equally vital artery pulsed with life far to the north. This was the Amber Road, a golden highway that stretched for over 1,500 miles, from the misty, pine-fringed shores of the Baltic Sea all the way down to the sun-baked heart of the Mediterranean. Its name came from its most precious cargo, a substance that northern tribes called the gold of the north. This was not a metal mined from rock, but a product of time and trees. Amber, fossilized resin from ancient forests, washed up on Baltic beaches by the relentless action of the sea. To the people of the ancient world, amber was a material of profound mystery and allure. It was lighter than stone, yet it could be polished to a warm, honey-like glow. It was organic, sometimes trapping perfectly preserved insects and plant matter from millions of years ago, creating miniature, impossible windows into a lost world. And it possessed a strange, almost magical property. When rubbed against cloth, it builds up a static electric charge, a phenomenon the Greeks called electron, the root of our modern word electricity. This combination of beauty, mystery, and seeming supernatural power made it an object of immense desire. It was carved into intricate beads, amulets, and figurines, believed to ward off evil spirits, cure ailments, and bring good fortune. This northern treasure traveled south along a network of river routes and overland trails, often following the great rivers like the Vistula and the Elbe, which acted as natural funnels guiding the flow of commerce. The journey was long and arduous, with the raw amber passing through countless hands. It would begin with coastal communities who gathered the raw lumps from the sand. From there, local chieftains in what is now Poland and Germany would control its initial movement, trading it south to Celtic tribes, who were master artisans in their own right. These Celtic middlemen would then pass it on to the Etruscans in Italy, and finally, it would reach the ultimate consumers of the classical world, the empires of Greece and Rome. The discovery of ornate amber artifacts in the tomb of the Egyptian pharaoh Tutankhamun, and accounts from Roman writers like Pliny the Elder describing its northern origin, provide undeniable proof of this incredible reach. A simple piece of resin picked up on a cold beach in Prussia could end its journey gracing the neck of an Egyptian queen or being admired in a Roman villa, a tangible symbol of a world already intimately connected. But amber was never a solo traveler. The caravans and boats moving south were not filled with just one commodity. The Amber Road was a multi-lane highway of exchange. On the return trip back north, those same traders would bring goods that were rare and coveted in the colder climates, fine bronze and silver work from Mediterranean workshops, shimmering glass beads, potent wine, and elegant pottery. This north-south exchange created a powerful economic symbiosis. The northern tribes, often dismissed by southern writers as barbarians, were not passive recipients. They were active, savvy participants in a vast economic system. They controlled the source of a product that the most powerful empires on Earth desperately wanted. In return, they gained not just luxury items, but technologies and materials that elevated their own societies. The flow of high-quality Mediterranean metals, for instance, revolutionized toolmaking and weaponry in Northern Europe. This trade also had a darker, more tragic dimension. The route facilitated the exchange of slaves, with people captured in intertribal conflicts often being sent south to the Roman markets, a sobering reminder that the connectivity of these ancient networks was not always a force for good. The physical evidence of this bustling network is etched into the landscape of Europe. Archaeologists have uncovered a chain of fortified settlements and trading posts that dotted the Amber Road. These were not grand cities, but strategic way stations, often located at river crossings or at the intersections of tribal territories. Places like Biskupin in Poland or the Magdalenska Gora in Slovenia were bustling hubs where amber was weighed, assessed for quality, and traded for southern goods. Excavations at these sites reveal a fascinating mix of local and imported artifacts, Baltic amber fragments lying alongside Roman coins, and Celtic brooches found next to Mediterranean amphorae that once held wine or olive oil. These sites were the ancient equivalent of customs posts and free trade zones, managed by local elites who grew wealthy and powerful by controlling the flow. They provided security, storage, and a neutral ground for negotiation, making the long-distance trade possible and profitable. The Amber Road, therefore, stands as a powerful testament to a simple yet profound economic truth. A single, universally desired commodity can build bridges between worlds that seem entirely separate. It connected the tribal, forest-dwelling societies of a cold, remote corner of Europe with the marble-columned, literate empires of the Mediterranean. It created a dialogue between the North and the South, a constant exchange that moved not just objects, but tastes, technologies, and ideas. From the cold, grey shores of the Baltic, a warm, golden network of human connection emerged, proving that even in the most unlikely of places, commerce has the power to weave the world together. From the golden shores of the Baltic, we now turn our gaze to a landscape of a very different, almost alien nature, the vast, sun-scorched expanse of the Sahara Desert. To the untrained eye, this is a place of pure desolation, an endless sea of sand dunes and rocky plateaus that seems to forbid life and repel connection. But for the skilled traders of the medieval world, this apparent barrier was in fact the world's greatest bridge. Across its unforgiving heart, a network of caravan routes pulsed with life, creating vital economic and cultural lifelines that connected the powerful empires of West Africa with the bustling markets of North Africa and the wider Mediterranean world. The engine of this incredible network was a simple yet dramatic exchange. From the south came gold, vast quantities of it, mined from the rich deposits within the empires of Ghana and later Mali. This West African gold would go on to mint the coins of sultans and kings across the Muslim world, and even fuel the economies of Renaissance Europe. And from the north came salt, transported from massive mines in the desert like those at Takeza, where slaves dug blocks of solid salt from the earth. In our modern world, salt is a cheap and common seasoning, but in the ancient world, especially in the humid, tropical climates of West Africa where salt was scarce, it was literally essential for survival. It preserved food, replaced vital minerals lost through sweat, and was so highly valued that, pound for pound, it was often traded for an equal weight of gold. This was not just commerce, it was a symbiotic relationship between two entirely different ecosystems, a perfect economic pairing that made the perilous journey across the desert not just possible, but immensely profitable. The cities that grew at the strategic nodes of this trade became legendary, none more so than Timbuktu. To many in the West, Timbuktu became a byword for the most remote place on Earth, a mythical, unreachable city. But in its heyday, during the height of the Mali Empire in the 14th century, Timbuktu was anything but remote. It was a dazzling cosmopolitan center, a hub of global importance. Its markets teemed with merchants from across Africa and the Middle East. Its streets were lined with skilled craftsmen, and its reputation for wealth was known from Cairo to Cordoba. But Timbuktu's true legacy was not just its gold, it was its intellectual capital. The city became a world-renowned center of Islamic scholarship and learning, attracting students and wise men from thousands of miles away. Vast libraries were assembled, containing tens of thousands of manuscripts on topics ranging from astronomy and mathematics to law and medicine. The University of Sankore, a loosely organized collection of schools and private libraries, became one of the great intellectual centers of the age, a beacon of knowledge in the heart of the African continent. The wealth generated by the salt and gold trade directly funded this cultural flourishing, proving that commerce could build not just empires, but centers of enlightenment. The caravans that made this all possible were monumental undertakings, epic feats of logistics and human endurance. Picture a train of thousands of camels, the only pack animal capable of surviving the weeks-long journey without water, snaking its way across the dunes in a single file that could stretch for miles. These were not random groups of travelers. They were highly organized commercial enterprises, often financed by powerful merchants or rulers. Their organization was military in its precision. They had to be. The desert offered a relentless onslaught of dangers: scorching daytime heat that could cause fatal heat stroke, freezing nights that could claim the unprepared, and sudden, blinding sandstorms that could erase trails and bury men and animals alive. Thirst was a constant companion, and navigation was a matter of life and death. Long before the magnetic compass was common in this part of the world, the caravan guides, the Mukadimon, were masters of celestial navigation. They read the stars with an intimacy we can barely comprehend today, using the positions of constellations to maintain their course across a featureless landscape. They memorized the subtle signs of the desert, the shape of a dune, the type of rock, the rare presence of a particular plant, all of which served as waypoints on their mental maps. These caravans were moving cities, carrying not only their precious cargo of gold and salt, but also all the supplies needed for the journey: food, water, tents, and trade goods for the communities they would meet at desert oases. The success of a single crossing was a triumph of human knowledge and resilience over one of the planet's most hostile environments. The impact of this trade, however, extended far beyond the flow of two simple commodities. The Trans-Saharan routes were a conduit for a much broader and more profound exchange. The north-south movement of people and goods transferred revolutionary technologies. The knowledge of ironworking, which had spread south across the desert, allowed West African societies to produce superior farming tools and weaponry, strengthening their agricultural base and military power. Perhaps the most significant import was a new system of belief. Islam traveled south with the Berber and Arab merchants, slowly taking root in the courts of West African rulers. The adoption of Islam by powerful emperors, most famously Mansa Musa of Mali, had a transformative effect. It integrated West Africa into the vast, interconnected community of the Muslim world, facilitating diplomatic and scholarly exchanges. Mansa Musa's legendary pilgrimage to Mecca in the 1300s is the perfect example. His journey was not a quiet, private affair. It was a grand procession that included thousands of attendants and carried so much gold that he inadvertently caused a temporary devaluation of the metal in the markets of Cairo and Medina, stunning the Islamic world with a visible display of West African wealth and piety. This pilgrimage put Mali on the map, quite literally, for European and Middle Eastern cartographers. The political ideas that came with Islam, including new models of administration and law, helped to centralize and strengthen the great West African empires. The desert, which for so long had been seen as an impenetrable barrier, a sea of sand that divided the continent, was revealed to be precisely the opposite. It was a bridge, a dynamic and challenging one, but a bridge nonetheless. It connected the vibrant, gold-rich civilizations south of the Sahara with the intellectual and economic powerhouse of the Mediterranean and the Middle East. This exchange wove the societies of West Africa firmly into the fabric of the Old World, creating a truly transcontinental network whose legacy of cultural fusion, intellectual achievement, and economic interdependence continues to shape the region to this day. Now, let us travel from the dry ocean of the Sahara to another landscape of stark and brutal beauty, the deserts of southern Arabia. Here, in a land that receives almost no rainfall, where the very air seems to thirst, grew trees that produced the most coveted fragrances of the ancient world: frankincense and myrrh. These were not mere perfumes. They were sacred substances, the very breath of the divine, and the demand for them was so immense and so universal that it carved a dedicated network of trade routes right through the heart of the wilderness. The incense route was born from this spiritual hunger, a specialized highway for aroma that connected the remote, fog-drenched mountains of Oman and Yemen, where the scraggly boswellia and commiphora trees were carefully cultivated, to the temples, palaces, and funeral pyres of empires thousands of miles away. Harvesting these resins was a delicate, generations-old art. Workers would make precise incisions in the bark of the trees, and a milky, fragrant sap would bleed out, hardening into tear-shaped droplets over several weeks. These precious tears were then gathered by hand, sorted by color and quality, and packed into sacks to begin their long journey north. The value of this cargo was astronomical. Frankincense and myrrh were worth their weight in gold, and sometimes even more, because their utility was woven into the very fabric of ancient life, death, and belief. In the sprawling, multi-ethnic Roman Empire, no religious ceremony was considered complete without the smoke of burning frankincense rising to the heavens, a visual and olfactory offering to the gods. Myrrh, with its earthy, bitter aroma, was a cornerstone of ancient medicine, used as an antiseptic for wounds, a treatment for inflammation, and a key ingredient in countless remedies. But perhaps its most poignant use was in the rituals of death. Both the Egyptians and the Romans used massive quantities of myrrh for embalming and for anointing the bodies of the deceased, believing its preservative qualities and sacred scent would accompany the soul into the afterlife. This convergence of spiritual, medicinal, and funerary needs created an economic force of unbelievable power, a demand that could transform a barren desert into a river of gold. Controlling even a small portion of this river was the key to building a kingdom, and no one mastered this art better than the Nabateans. This Arab people, originally nomadic, possessed a genius for logistics, geography, and diplomacy. They established their capital, Petra, in a hidden valley in modern-day Jordan, a location of breathtaking strategic brilliance, accessible only through a narrow, winding canyon known as the Sick, which could be easily defended. Petra sat at the perfect crossroads. It was the nexus where the incense route from Arabia met other trade routes bringing silks from the east and spices from the south. The Nabateans did not just tax the caravans passing through, they controlled the entire supply chain. They provided armed escorts, secured water at desert oases, and negotiated safe passage with the various tribes whose territories the routes crossed. The wealth they extracted from this monopoly is still visible today, carved directly into the cliffs of Petra. The magnificent treasury, with its ornate, classical facade hewn from the rose-red rock, was not a palace or a temple in the traditional sense, but most likely a royal tomb and a ceremonial reception hall designed to awe visiting merchants and dignitaries. The entire city, with its tombs, temples, and theaters all carved directly into the living rock, stands as a monumental declaration of success, a civilization literally built by the prophets of perfume. The Nabateans understood that in the desert, water was more valuable than gold, and they complemented their control of the trade routes with a masterful system of water conservation, channeling flash floods through a complex network of dams, cisterns, and canals, ensuring that Petra could support a large population and service the massive caravans. The incense route, therefore, offers a profound lesson in economic history. It demonstrates with stunning clarity that human commerce is not driven by material needs alone. The deepest, most powerful markets can be built on something as intangible as faith, as personal as ritual, and as universal as the fear of death and the hope for an afterlife. The caravans that trudged across the Arabian desert, their camels laden with sacks of fragrant resin, were carrying more than a luxury commodity. They were carrying the prayers of Roman priests, the hopes of Egyptian embalmers, and the devotions of countless worshippers from Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean. The scent of frankincense and myrrh, rising from 1,000 altars, carried the anxieties and aspirations of the ancient world. This network proves that one of the most powerful engines of commerce throughout human history has not been the stomach, but the soul. All of these sprawling trade networks, crisscrossing deserts and threading through mountain passes, shared one fundamental dependency. They relied on the brave souls who piloted the vessels that carried their precious cargo, and those vessels were only as effective as the technology that built and guided them. The true engine of maritime trade, the force that shrank the world and made these intercontinental exchanges a consistent reality, was a series of quiet revolutions in shipbuilding and navigation. Think of the vast Indian Ocean, a body of water so immense it seems to defy crossing. For the merchants who plied its waters, the most vital piece of technology wasn't just their ship, but their profound understanding of the wind. They sailed on the sturdy, elegant dhows, vessels characterized by their distinctive triangular sails. This was the lateen sail, a brilliant innovation that changed everything. Unlike a simple square sail that primarily catches wind from behind, the lateen sail was a versatile airfoil. It could be angled to catch winds coming from the side, even from slightly ahead, allowing a dhow to tack against the wind, to zigzag its way forward instead of being stuck waiting for a favorable breeze. This maneuverability was a superpower, but the real magic was in how the dhow's design married with the environment. The merchants of the Indian Ocean didn't fight the monsoons, they used them as a scheduled maritime highway. For 6 months, the winds blew steadily from the southwest, perfect for pushing a loaded dhow from the Arabian Peninsula to the spice ports of India. Then, as if on a celestial clock, the winds reversed, blowing from the northeast for the other half of the year, carrying those same ships, now laden with pepper, cinnamon, and gems, back home. This predictable rhythm turned the Indian Ocean into a seasonal conveyor belt, a system so reliable it allowed for the planning of trade missions months or even years in advance. On the other side of the world, in the shipyards of China, a different kind of maritime giant was taking shape. While the dhow was a masterpiece of agile design, the Chinese junk was a testament to overwhelming scale and engineering prowess. These were the largest wooden ships the world had ever seen, floating fortresses capable of carrying hundreds of sailors, soldiers, and merchants, along with tons of porcelain, silk, and tea. Their most ingenious feature was the stern-mounted rudder, a far more effective steering mechanism than the side-mounted steering oars used in the West for centuries. But the true structural marvel was their hull, divided into multiple watertight compartments by a series of bulkheads. This was a safety innovation centuries ahead of its time. If the ship sprang a leak in one section, the water would be contained there, allowing the vessel to remain afloat and continue its journey. This simple yet revolutionary idea drastically reduced the risk of catastrophic sinking, giving Chinese admirals and merchants the confidence to send their most valuable cargoes on long, perilous voyages across the South China Sea and into the Indian Ocean. A ship, no matter how well built, is useless if it is lost. This is where the twin arts of navigation and timekeeping transformed seafaring from a form of coastal gambling into a calculated science. For millennia, sailors rarely ventured out of sight of land, using headlands and familiar coastlines as their guides. To cross the open ocean, they needed a way to know where they were when the land had disappeared over the horizon. The magnetic compass, a Chinese invention that diffused westward through trade, was the first true game changer. By aligning a magnetized needle with the Earth's magnetic field, it provided a constant, reliable reference point for direction. No longer were mariners at the complete mercy of the clouds and stars. They could now maintain a steady course through overcast skies and stormy weather. But knowing your direction is only half the battle. To truly know your position, especially your latitude, your distance north or south of the equator, you needed the stars. The astrolabe and its simpler maritime cousin, the mariner's astrolabe, was a sophisticated calculator made of brass and wood. By measuring the angle of the sun at noon or a known star like Polaris above the horizon, a skilled navigator could calculate their latitude with remarkable accuracy. This was the GPS of the ancient and medieval world. It allowed a captain to point his ship toward a known parallel of latitude and sail east or west with the confidence that he would eventually make landfall at his desired destination. The cumulative effect of these technologies was nothing short of a geographical revolution. They systematically dismantled the terror of the open ocean. Vast bodies of water that had once been portrayed on maps as domains of sea monsters and the edges of the world were transformed into predictable, navigable highways. The Indian Ocean became a unified economic zone, linking East Africa to the Middle East, India, and Southeast Asia. The Mediterranean, once the domain of coastal huggers, could be crossed with confidence. These advancements enabled the consistent, large-scale transfer that defines true global networks. It was no longer about a single, heroic voyage. It was about the establishment of regular, scheduled trade that could move not just a few trinkets, but enough goods to change entire economies and diets. Without these ships and the tools that guided them, the spice routes would have remained a trickle, the Silk Road would have lacked its vital maritime counterpart, and the world would have remained a collection of isolated continents. The mastery of wind, wood, and wave was, in the most literal sense, the mastery of human destiny, setting the course for everything that was to come. Think of a merchant caravan not as a simple line of camels, but as a traveling symposium. Or picture a trading ship not just as a cargo hold, but as a floating library. These vessels were the original universities of the ancient world, and their most transformative cargo was not the silk that clothed emperors or the spices that flavored feasts, but something far more potent and enduring: ideas. This phenomenon, known as cultural cross-pollination, was the silent, often unintended superpower of ancient trade networks. When a sack of pepper was sold in a foreign port, it wasn't just a financial transaction, it was an invitation. Along with that pepper came the merchant's language, his manner of dress, the stories he told of his homeland, and the beliefs he carried in his heart. The goods were the ticket, but the ideas were the main event. Consider the single most revolutionary concept in the history of mathematics, the number zero. For centuries, sophisticated mathematical systems in places like Rome and Greece struggled without a symbol for nothing, for the void. Their systems were brilliant but cumbersome. Meanwhile, in India, mathematicians had not only conceived of zero, but had integrated it into a revolutionary place-value numeral system. This was an abstract leap of genius, the idea that nothing could be a number with immense power. How did this concept travel? It moved along the very trade routes that connected Indian mathematicians with Arab scholars in bustling centers like Baghdad. Arab thinkers, acting as the world's great knowledge synthesizers, recognized the sheer brilliance of this system, adopted it, refined it, and began using it in their own astronomical and mathematical works. From there, it was only a matter of time before this Indian-born, Arab-refined knowledge traveled further west, into the heart of Europe through trade contacts in places like Islamic Spain and Sicily. When it finally arrived, it was met with suspicion by some, who saw it as a dangerous and pagan concept, but its utility was undeniable. The concept of zero and the Hindu-Arabic numeral system it enabled would eventually become the bedrock of everything from double-entry bookkeeping to the scientific revolution and the digital age. All of this was made possible because trade routes provided a continuous, living conduit for knowledge, allowing a philosophical idea born in one corner of the world to slowly, patiently, transform the entire globe. The exchange of ideas was just as vividly expressed in stone and mortar as it was on parchment. Architectural styles, those most visible signatures of a culture, proved to be incredibly mobile. Take the simple yet profoundly powerful arch. While often associated with Roman engineering majesty, the concept of the arch was known and used in various forms across the ancient world. But as Roman legions and merchants expanded, they carried their engineering principles with them, and the arch became a symbol of Roman power and sophistication. However, the story doesn't end with Roman export. This architectural idea was absorbed, adapted, and reinterpreted by every culture it touched. In Persia, the arch evolved into the grand, soaring iwans that defined royal mosques and palaces, open on one side to create a monumental, welcoming space. As Islamic influence spread eastward along the Silk Road, these very Persian-influenced designs appeared in Central Asia and even into China, where they blended with local building traditions to create unique structures. You can see this fusion in the Great Mosque of Xi'an, where classic Chinese pagoda roofs and brightly colored wooden structures coexist with the arched gateways and layouts inspired by Persian and Arab mosque design. This was not mere copying, it was a creative conversation in brick and tile. A Chinese builder seeing an arch for the first time wouldn't just replicate it blindly. He would interpret it through the lens of his own centuries-old architectural language, using local materials and aesthetic sensibilities. The result was something entirely new, a hybrid form that bore the cultural DNA of both its origin and its new home. This constant, slow-motion dialogue of design, facilitated by the movement of artisans, traders, and even captured engineers along these routes, ensured that the world's skylines became a beautiful, complex palimpsest of borrowed and blended ideas. Perhaps the most profound travelers of all were not concepts or styles, but entire systems of belief. The great world religions Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam did not spread solely through conquest or the dedicated work of missionaries. They hitched a ride on the commercial highways. The Silk Road, for instance, became the primary vector for the movement of Buddhism out of its Indian birthplace. It was not an organized missionary campaign that first brought Buddhism to China, but the slow, steady infiltration of ideas carried by merchant communities. Buddhist monks, recognizing the safety and infrastructure of these routes, often traveled with the large caravans. At caravanserais and in market towns, they would preach, establish small shrines, and translate their sutras. The cave temples at Dunhuang, a crucial oasis on the Silk Road, are a breathtaking museum of this fusion. Here, in hundreds of man-made caves, the art tells a story of cultural blending. The Buddhist figures depicted have the graceful, flowing robes inspired by Indian Gupta art, but their faces sometimes carry the softer, more rounded features of Chinese nobility, and the background scenes might include Central Asian textiles or even hints of Hellenistic influence left over from Alexander the Great's ancient incursions. Similarly, Christianity found its way across the Mediterranean world and into the hinterlands along Roman trade routes, and later through the maritime networks of the Mediterranean. And Islam experienced its most rapid and widespread expansion not just through military conquest, but through its deep association with trade. Muslim merchants, living by the ethical and legal codes of their faith, established diaspora communities in port cities from the Swahili coast of Africa to the Malay archipelago. Their reputation for honesty and their sophisticated commercial practices made them attractive partners. Their mosques became centers of community life, not just for them, but as points of curiosity and attraction for local rulers. A king might first be interested in the goods a Muslim merchant offered, but he would also become intrigued by the faith that provided the moral and legal framework for their success. The adoption of Islam by influential rulers then opened the floodgates for a deeper exchange of knowledge, law, and science, as we saw with the transformation of Timbuktu into a center of Islamic scholarship. In every case, the merchant was the unsung evangelist. Their networks provided the physical pathways and the social trust necessary for new beliefs to take root in foreign soil. This process was rarely swift and never a simple overlay. When Buddhism entered China, it had to contend with the deeply established philosophies of Confucianism and Taoism. It adapted, emphasizing aspects of its teachings that resonated with local values, and in doing so, became a distinctly Chinese form of Buddhism. This is the ultimate lesson of cultural cross-pollination. When cultures meet through trade, they do not simply exchange goods or replace one idea with another. They engage in a creative, often unpredictable alchemy. They argue, they borrow, they blend, and they innovate. The most enduring and transformative imports were never just the spices or the silks. They were the revolutionary concepts, the new ways of seeing the world, and the spiritual frameworks that gave meaning to life itself. The marketplace was, and always has been, a marketplace of ideas. This constant flow of people and goods created the perfect conditions for something even more revolutionary than the goods themselves: the spread of the very tools and techniques that would redefine what societies were capable of achieving. Ancient trade routes became the primary vector for the movement of revolutionary technologies, acting as a slow-motion internet that transmitted blueprints and know-how across continents. Perhaps no single invention better illustrates this transformative journey than paper. In China, as early as the 2nd century, court officials had perfected a method of pulping rags, hemp, and tree bark into a smooth, flexible, and relatively inexpensive writing surface. This was a monumental leap forward from heavy bamboo slips or prohibitively expensive silk. For centuries, this incredible secret was closely guarded by the Chinese Empire. But secrets have a way of leaking out, especially when they are carried on the backs of camels and in the minds of travelers. The knowledge of papermaking began its westward creep along the Silk Road, not as a formal export, but through a combination of trade and conflict. A pivotal moment occurred in the 8th century at the Battle of Tollos, a confrontation between the expanding Tang dynasty and the Abbasid Caliphate. Among the prisoners taken by the victorious Arab forces were Chinese papermakers. These skilled artisans, their lives spared for their valuable knowledge, were brought to the glittering Abbasid capital of Samarra. There they established the first paper mills in the Islamic world. But this was not a simple act of copying. The Arabs, brilliant innovators in their own right, immediately began to improve the process. They experimented with new raw materials, notably linen and flax, which produced a stronger, more refined sheet. They established systematic, water-powered mills that could produce paper on an industrial scale. This adapted, improved paper technology then spread like wildfire across the Muslim world, from the markets of Baghdad to the libraries of Cordoba. It replaced cumbersome papyrus and costly parchment, dramatically lowering the cost of books and creating an explosion of literacy, record-keeping, and scholarly activity that preserved classical knowledge and fueled Islamic golden age. Centuries later, this same technology would enter Europe through Sicily and Muslim Spain, eventually leading to the invention of the printing press and igniting the European Renaissance. The journey of paper from a Chinese court secret to a global foundation of knowledge is a perfect metaphor for the entire process of technological diffusion. It was never a simple hand-off. It was a relay race of innovation where each civilization that received the baton ran with it, adapting and improving it for their own needs before passing it on. This pattern of adaptation repeated itself with other world-altering Chinese inventions. Gunpowder, first concocted by Taoist alchemists seeking an elixir for immortality, traveled west along the same route. Initially used in China for fireworks and ceremonial noisemakers, its military potential was quickly realized. But when the knowledge of this black powder reached the Middle East and Europe, its application was radically transformed. European engineers living in a world of stone castles and plate armor became obsessed with harnessing its explosive power. They experimented relentlessly, developing metal-barreled cannons that could reduce fortress walls to rubble and handheld firearms that could pierce a knight's armor. This technological transfer fundamentally shattered the old feudal order, making castles obsolete and giving centralized monarchies a powerful new tool to enforce their authority. The very nature of warfare was rewritten because a formula for an elixir of life traveled along a trade route. Similarly, the magnetic compass, a Chinese device that used a magnetized needle to point south, began as a mystical tool for geomancy and fortune-telling. As it moved westward through trade, it was stripped of its divinatory purpose and repurposed by Arab and then European mariners as the most crucial navigational instrument ever devised. It gave sailors the confidence to venture far from the sight of land, to cross vast oceans, and to ultimately connect the entire globe in the age of exploration. In each case, the receiving culture did not just adopt the technology, they reinvented it, focusing on aspects the original inventors had barely considered, proving that the context of a society determines the destiny of an invention. Sometimes the most transformative technologies were not complex chemical formulas or intricate devices, but stunningly simple mechanical aids. Consider the humble stirrup. This was a basic innovation that emerged from the steppes of Asia, likely from cultures whose lives were built around the horse. It was nothing more than a ring of metal or leather hung from a saddle to support a rider's foot. But this simple loop had earth-shattering consequences. Before the stirrup, a warrior on horseback was essentially a mobile platform. He could ride to battle quickly, but the actual fighting was precarious. He could throw javelins or slash with a sword, but the force of his blow was limited to the strength of his own arm. Any forceful impact risked unseating him. The stirrup changed everything. It gave a rider a stable, integrated platform. By bracing his feet in the stirrups, he could rise in the saddle and put the full weight and momentum of his charging horse behind a lance. This created a new, devastating form of combat, the heavily armored knight delivering a couched lance charge. This single innovation revolutionized warfare in medieval Europe, creating a new military aristocracy whose power was based on their expensive war horses and armor, and cementing the social and economic system of feudalism for centuries. A simple tool designed for stability on the open plains of Central Asia had, through the slow currents of trade and migration, completely reshaped the political and social landscape of a continent thousands of miles away. The movement of metallurgical techniques tells a similar story of collaborative progress. Advanced methods for producing high-quality steel, such as the crucible steel method known as Wootz in India and Damascus steel in the Middle East, were highly sought-after secrets. Blades forged from this metal were legendary for their sharpness, durability, and distinctive watery pattern. The knowledge of how to create this superior steel traveled, but it was not a complete package. Different regions along the trade routes possessed different resources, different iron ores, different types of carbon for fuel, different clays for crucibles. As the knowledge spread, each group of smiths experimented and adapted the process, creating their own regional variations and specialties. The result was a slow, collective improvement in metalworking across Eurasia. driven by the exchange of both finished products and the technical knowledge behind them. This ongoing dialogue of innovation demonstrates a fundamental truth that challenges our modern notions of solitary genius and isolated invention. The great leaps of human progress were almost never the product of a single culture working in a vacuum. They were the result of a vast, ancient, and collaborative conversation, a slow-motion brainstorming session that spanned continents and centuries. An idea would be born in one place, then travel, be tested, refined, and sometimes completely reimagined in another. The movement of technology along these ancient networks proves that progress itself is a collective human inheritance, built link by link across the chain of civilization. These sprawling trade networks did far more than just move exotic goods from one corner of the world to another. They wove together the first truly global economy, a sophisticated and deeply interconnected system that functioned for centuries before the term globalization was ever coined. This was not a collection of isolated local markets. It was a single, pulsating web of finance where a decision made in a Venetian counting house could affect the price of pepper in Calicut, and the discovery of a new silver mine in Bolivia could send economic shockwaves all the way to the imperial treasury in Beijing. The foundation of this system was the creation of universal standards of value. In a world of countless languages and currencies, traders needed a common language of commerce. Precious metals, particularly gold and silver, became that language. A gold dinar minted by an Abbasid caliph in Baghdad held a recognized value in the port cities of India. A Byzantine solidus, with its reliable gold content, was accepted from the markets of Constantinople to the caravanserais of Central Asia. This was the world's first hard currency, a universally trusted medium of exchange that allowed a Sogdian merchant to sell his silk in Samarkand for gold, travel to Baghdad, and use that same gold to purchase glassware, confident that its value would be recognized. But carrying vast quantities of heavy, vulnerable metal across thousands of miles was incredibly risky. This practical challenge sparked one of the most revolutionary innovations in human history: the development of financial instruments that separated value from its physical form. Along the Silk Road and the Indian Ocean trade routes, systems of credit and sophisticated contract law began to emerge. A merchant could deposit his money with a trusted banker in his home city, receive a paper bill of exchange, and then present that bill to the banker's associate in a distant trading hub to receive his funds in the local currency. This was the brilliant essence of the Hawala system, a precursor to modern banking that relied not on moving cash, but on moving information and trust through a network of brokers. It drastically reduced the risk of theft and streamlined long-distance commerce. Similarly, merchants developed complex partnership agreements, spreading the immense risk of a long voyage across multiple investors. If one ship sank, the loss would not ruin a single family but would be absorbed by the collective, a primitive but effective form of insurance. These were the building blocks of modern finance, all born from the necessity of managing risk and facilitating exchange across vast distances. The interconnected nature of this ancient economy meant that a single event in one region could have dramatic, unforeseen consequences in another, a phenomenon we are intimately familiar with today. Consider the great flow of precious metals. For centuries, the primary sources of gold for the Eastern Hemisphere were the powerful empires of West Africa, like Ghana and Mali. This steady stream of yellow metal flowed north across the Sahara, financing the sophistication of the Islamic world and eventually making its way into European coffers. Then, in the 16th century, the Spanish stumbled upon the monumental silver deposits of Potosi in modern-day Bolivia and later in Mexico. Suddenly, a massive new flood of silver entered the global system via the Spanish treasure fleets that sailed from the Americas to Seville. The Spanish used this silver to finance their wars and, crucially, to purchase the luxury goods they craved from Asia, particularly Chinese silk and porcelain. This enormous influx of Spanish silver into the Chinese economy had a profound effect. China at the time operated on a silver standard, using the metal for large transactions and to pay taxes. The massive injection of new silver from the Spanish, who were essentially paying for Chinese goods with American-mined metal, led to a sustained period of inflation in China. The value of silver relative to goods decreased, meaning prices rose. This price revolution was a direct, tangible link between the silver mines of South America and the marketplaces of Ming Dynasty China, proving that these ancient trade networks had indeed created a single, sensitive economic organism. This proto-global economy also operated on the fundamental principles of supply and demand, specialization, and what economists would later call comparative advantage. Entire regions became famous for producing one specific good that the rest of the world desired, and they structured their societies around that production. The Malabar coast of India became the pepper garden of the world. The islands of Ternate and Tidore in modern Indonesia were the only sources of cloves. The Baltic region specialized in amber and furs. Southern Arabia focused exclusively on frankincense and myrrh. This specialization was not random, it was a rational response to global demand. These regions discovered that they could achieve greater prosperity by focusing on what they could produce most efficiently and then trading that surplus for everything else they needed, rather than trying to be self-sufficient in all things. A farmer in the Moluccas realized it was far more profitable to dedicate his land to cultivating precious clove trees and then trade those cloves for Indian cotton, Chinese porcelain, and Arabian incense than it would be to try to grow grain or weave his own cloth. This is the principle of comparative advantage in action, a concept we teach in modern economics textbooks, but one that was being practiced intuitively by ancient traders thousands of years ago. The system created a deep and powerful interdependence. The prosperity of the Venetian Republic was entirely dependent on the continued flow of spices from Alexandria. The wealth of the West African empires of Ghana and Mali was inextricably linked to the Mediterranean world's insatiable appetite for gold. If political instability disrupted the Trans-Saharan caravans, the entire economy of the Mali Empire could falter. Conversely, if demand for gold fell in the north, the southern economies would suffer. This was a world where the fate of a kingdom could be decided by the changing tastes of consumers on a different continent, a level of global interdependence that feels remarkably modern, yet its roots are ancient. The bustling markets, the credit notes, the specialized production, and the far-flung economic ripple effects all demonstrate that the roots of our modern financial systems, from global banking to international supply chains, are not inventions of the industrial or digital ages. They are deeply entangled with these old trading paths, a legacy of economic sophistication written not in ledgers, but in the very dust of the caravan trails and the salt-stained logs of ancient merchant ships. But a network is only as strong as its nodes, the bustling, vibrant, and incredibly wealthy cities that served as the great crossroads of the ancient world. These were not just random settlements that happened to be in the right place. They were strategic masterpieces, nerve centers of global commerce that grew fabulously rich and powerful by positioning themselves as the ultimate controllers of trade flows. Their rise was often a matter of geographical luck or brilliant foresight, but their story is a powerful lesson in the fleeting nature of economic supremacy and the constant, relentless evolution of global power. Think of a city like Constantinople, the magnificent capital of the Byzantine Empire. Its location was nothing short of genius, a natural fortress perched on a peninsula, guarding the narrow strait of the Bosporus that separates Europe from Asia. Every single caravan traveling the land routes between the two continents, and every ship moving from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, had to pass by its mighty walls. The city became a colossal toll booth and the world's most magnificent warehouse. Its markets overflowed with silk from China, spices from India, furs from Russia, and grain from Egypt. At its peak, it was the largest and wealthiest city in Europe, a dazzling beacon of Christian civilization whose grandeur was so immense that visitors from the rural West were often struck speechless. But its entire existence was predicated on its control of that single, vital passageway. Then there was Baghdad, the legendary round city founded by the Abbasid caliphs in the 8th century. It was placed deliberately at the nexus of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, linking it to the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean trade routes to the east, while also connecting to the overland caravan trails stretching to the Mediterranean and Central Asia. Under the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, Baghdad became the intellectual and commercial capital of the world. Its House of Wisdom was a global think tank where scholars from every corner of the empire, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, gathered to translate the works of the Greeks, Persians, and Indians, advancing medicine, astronomy, and mathematics. The city's wealth was proverbial. Its bazaars were said to sell everything from exotic parrots and precious gems to slaves and scientific instruments. It was a true melting pot where cultures didn't just meet, they fused, creating a new, dynamic Islamic civilization that would set the standard for the world for centuries. On the other side of the world, a very different kind of trading empire was rising from the water. Venice was built on a swampy lagoon, a location with no natural resources, no farmland, and no defensive advantages beyond its tricky, shifting waterways that confused invaders. The Venetians turned this apparent weakness into their greatest strength. They looked away from the land and became a nation of sailors, shipbuilders, and merchants. Their entire society was organized around trade. They positioned themselves as the crucial link between the Islamic East and the Christian West. Venetian merchants established fortified trading posts all across the eastern Mediterranean, creating a network that funneled the spices, silks, and sugars of Asia into the eager markets of Europe. The wealth this generated was staggering. The city's canals were lined with palaces that seemed to be made of lace and marble, funded by profits that were often 1,000% or more on a single cargo of pepper. The Venetian Republic was not ruled by a king, but by a merchant aristocracy, a government of businessmen for whom commerce was the highest form of statecraft. Their power was not in land or armies, but in their ledger books and their mastery of global supply chains. And in the humid, spice-scented air of India's Malabar coast, the city of Calicut thrived as the great emporium of the Indian Ocean. Its Hindu rulers, the Zamorins, were famously tolerant and pragmatic, declaring their port a free trade city open to all merchants, regardless of religion or nationality. Arab dhows, Chinese junks, Jewish trading vessels, and later Portuguese carracks all jostled for space in its harbor. The city had no walls because its defense was its economic indispensability. To attack Calicut was to attack the profits of everyone who traded there. It was a place where a deal could be sealed with a handshake and a man's word was his bond, a reputation for fairness that made it the most trusted and efficient marketplace in the known world. These cities became more than just economic engines, they were crucibles of human creativity. They attracted the most ambitious minds, the most skilled craftsmen, and the most daring innovators. In Constantinople, Greek fire, a terrifying and secret incendiary weapon, was developed to protect its harbor. In Baghdad, the scholar Al-Khwarizmi systematized algebra, a word derived from the title of his book. In Venice, the art of glassblowing on the island of Murano was perfected to such a degree that their craftsmen were forbidden from leaving the city lest they reveal its secrets. This concentration of talent, capital, and diverse perspectives created an environment where innovation was not just encouraged, it was inevitable. However, the very source of their glory was also the source of their vulnerability. Their fortunes were tied directly to the vitality of their trade routes, and when those routes shifted, these mighty cities could fall with shocking speed. The decline of Constantinople began with the sacking of the city by Western Crusaders in 1204, a blow from which it never fully recovered, but its final end came when the Ottoman Turks conquered it in 1453, finally severing Europe's direct land link to the spice trade and forcing them to seek new sea routes. Baghdad's magnificent libraries and palaces were utterly destroyed by the Mongol invasion in 1258, a catastrophe from which the city took centuries to recover. The discovery of a sea route to India by Vasco da Gama was a death sentence for Venice's monopoly. Suddenly, spices could be shipped directly from the source to Lisbon, bypassing the Venetian middlemen entirely. The wealth of the Indies now flowed to the Atlantic nations, and Venice slowly faded into a beautiful, watery museum of its former self. And Calicut, the queen of the Indian Ocean, saw its power crumble when the Portuguese, with their superior cannon-armed ships, used brute force to seize control of the spice trade, imposing a violent monopoly that shattered the old system of free and fair commerce. The story of these cities is a powerful reminder that in the grand sweep of history, no center of power is permanent. Their ruins and their surviving splendors stand as monuments to a time when geography was destiny, when controlling a single strait or a favorable harbor could make you the master of the world's wealth. Their rise and fall teaches us that global economic supremacy is a constantly moving target, always vulnerable to a new technology, a new discovery, or a sudden, devastating shift in the political winds. Behind the grand sweep of empires and the flow of priceless commodities, the true pulse of these ancient networks beat in the hearts of the people who made them work. Think less of abstract trade routes drawn on a map and more of a dusty, sun-beaten caravan driver squinting against the glare as he guides his groaning camel across a sea of sand. Or picture a sharp-eyed merchant haggling in a mix of 3 languages in a crowded Calicut bazaar, mentally calculating exchange rates and profit margins. Consider the weary but alert interpreter, whose knowledge of local customs and dialects could mean the difference between a successful transaction and a disastrous confrontation. These were not faceless cogs in a machine. They were the lifeblood of the entire system, the human sinew that connected distant worlds. Their value lay not in wealth or title, but in something far more precious and perishable, specialized, hard-won knowledge. A seasoned merchant possessed a mental library of routes, knowing which mountain pass was clear in spring, which well had sweet water, and which tribal chieftain expected a gift for safe passage. He understood the subtle nuances of markets, that the demand for cinnamon was higher in Alexandria than in Baghdad, or that a certain shade of Chinese blue and white porcelain was suddenly all the rage among the Persian elite. This was insider information gathered over a lifetime of travel, a living database of commerce that was passed down through families and trusted apprentices. It was this granular, practical intelligence that turned a dangerous journey into a profitable enterprise, while a select few, like the Venetian Marco Polo, achieved legendary status for their epic travels. Their stories are merely the most famous chapters in a much larger, untold epic. For every Marco Polo whose name echoes through history, there were tens of thousands of anonymous traders whose names are lost to time. The Sogdian merchant from Samarkand who spent his life ferrying silk between China and Persia. The Malay sailor who piloted his outrigger canoe across the Indian Ocean, carrying cloves and nutmeg to waiting Arab dhows. The Jewish Radhanite traders who maintained a remarkable network stretching from France to China, acting as a vital link between the Christian and Islamic worlds during the early Middle Ages. These countless, faceless individuals were the true architects of the system. They were the ones who loaded the camels, repaired the wagons, negotiated the local taxes, and showed up day after day to facilitate the millions of small exchanges that, when added together, built a global economy. In this constant movement, these traders became something new and remarkable, accidental cultural ambassadors. A Nestorian Christian merchant from Syria, settling in a Chinese port city like Quanzhou, would not only sell his goods but also build a church, introducing a new religion to a foreign land. A Chinese artisan traveling west might demonstrate the art of paper-making to curious Persian scholars. Through these daily interactions, these individuals developed a unique cosmopolitan identity. They were often multilingual, comfortable in a variety of settings, and tolerant of different customs out of sheer necessity. They were neither fully of their homeland nor fully of their adopted communities, but citizens of a new, borderless world defined by commerce and connection. They were, in every sense, the original global citizens. Of course, this life of connection was forged in a crucible of constant peril. The rewards could be astronomical. A single successful voyage could set up a merchant's family for generations, but the risks were equally immense, a constant shadow trailing every caravan and ship. Bandits and pirates were an ever-present threat, lying in wait along lonely stretches of desert track or in secluded island coves. A merchant's entire fortune, painstakingly assembled over years, could be lost in a single violent ambush. Then there were the natural dangers. A sudden sandstorm in the Taklamakan Desert could bury an entire caravan, leaving no trace. A typhoon in the South China Sea could shatter the strongest junk, sending its valuable cargo and all hands to the bottom. But perhaps the most insidious and feared danger was disease. These traders moved through different disease environments with no immunity to local illnesses. A merchant could be perfectly healthy in one city and succumb to a fever in the next, far from home and family. The very connections that brought wealth also brought pandemic, as traders unwittingly carried pathogens like the bubonic plague along the Silk Road, with devastating consequences for the populations they encountered. Yet, despite this gauntlet of dangers, they pressed on. What drove them? It was a powerful three-part engine: ambition, curiosity, and sheer resilience. The ambition for a better life, for wealth and status, was an undeniable motivator, but it was often paired with a genuine, burning curiosity about the world. The desire to see the fabled cities their fathers had described, to taste strange fruits, to witness unfamiliar customs. This was a powerful lure that pulled men and women far from the safety of their birthplaces. And underpinning it all was a profound, gritty resilience, the ability to endure blistering heat and freezing cold, to recover from financial ruin, to learn a new language, and to find a way to keep moving forward when everything seemed lost. The history of global trade, when you strip away the economics and the politics, is ultimately this human story. It is a saga of ambition that charted the unknown, of curiosity that bridged cultural chasms, and of a resilience that allowed humanity to weave a connected world long before the invention of the engine or the airplane. These pioneers, with their caravans and their ships, their ledgers and their linguistic skills, were the ones who truly built our world, one risky journey at a time. Yet for all the wonders these networks created, the shared knowledge, the blended cultures, the unprecedented wealth, there was a terrible and inescapable price to be paid. The very arteries that carried the lifeblood of civilization also became conduits for its deepest suffering, proving that a pathway open to light is inevitably open to shadow. The most chilling and democratic of these hidden passengers was disease. When people and animals moved across continents, they did not travel alone. They carried with them an invisible menagerie of viruses and bacteria to which distant populations had no immunity. The most catastrophic example was the Black Death, a pandemic of bubonic plague that swept across Eurasia in the 14th century. It did not appear out of nowhere. It traveled with terrifying efficiency along the very trade routes we have been celebrating. Historians and scientists now believe the plague bacterium, Yersinia pestis, originated in the steppes of Central Asia. From there, it hitched a ride on the fleas that lived on black rats, which were, in turn, stowaways in the saddlebags of caravan traders and the cargo holds of merchant ships moving along the Silk Road and sea lane. As these traders reached bustling cities like Constantinople, Kaffa, and eventually the ports of Italy, the disease exploded into dense urban populations with no natural defenses. The result was the single most devastating demographic disaster in human history. Between 1346 and 1353, the Black Death wiped out an estimated 30 to 50% of Europe's population, with similar death tolls across the Middle East and parts of Asia. Societies were brought to their knees, fields lay fallow for lack of farmers, entire towns were emptied, and the social and economic order was shattered. The very connectivity that had enriched the world now made it uniquely vulnerable to a microscopic killer, a grim reminder that global networks can amplify tragedy as easily as they can prosperity. This was not an isolated incident. It was a fundamental vulnerability of an interconnected world, a pattern that would repeat with the introduction of smallpox and measles to the Americas centuries later, with similarly apocalyptic consequences. Beyond the unintended consequences of disease lay a far more deliberate and brutal form of suffering, the institution of slavery, which was often directly fueled by the economic engines of long-distance trade. The demand for cheap, abundant labor to produce goods, work mines, and serve in households created a monstrous market in human lives. The Trans-Saharan slave trade was a cornerstone of the economy that connected West Africa to the Mediterranean. For over 1,000 years, caravans heading north carried not only gold and ivory, but also countless human beings captured in war or raided from vulnerable communities. These individuals were forced to march across the world's most unforgiving desert, chained and under brutal conditions, with many perishing from thirst, exhaustion, or exposure along the way. Those who survived were sold in slave markets in North Africa, from where they might be sent to work on sugar plantations, in salt mines, or as domestic servants across the Islamic world. This system was not on the scale of the later transatlantic trade, but it was vast and devastating, uprooting millions of people and creating a deep legacy of social disruption and human misery in West Africa. Simultaneously, a vibrant and equally brutal slave trade flourished in the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, driven by conflicts between Christians and Muslims and the insatiable demand for labor in both agricultural and urban settings. The Italian city-state of Genoa was a major hub, and the Crimean port of Kaffa was one of the largest slave markets in the world, where Slavic peoples from Eastern Europe were trafficked by Tatar raiders to be sold to Mamluk Egypt and the Ottoman Empire. This trafficking was not a peripheral activity, it was central to the economies of powerful states. The the wealth that built magnificent palaces and funded lavish courts was often extracted directly from the forced labor of countless unnamed individuals. The trade routes celebrated for spreading ideas and art were also the supply chains for this immense human suffering, demonstrating that the pursuit of profit could commodify human life itself. And where immense profits were to be had, violent conflict was never far behind. The control of these lucrative trade routes was not just an economic goal, it was a primary cause of war and a fundamental driver of imperial ambition. Rival powers understood that whoever controlled the choke points of global commerce could wield unparalleled influence and wealth. The centuries-long struggle between the Venetian Republic and the Ottoman Empire was, at its heart, a battle for control of the eastern Mediterranean trade routes to the Levant. This was not a clash of civilizations based purely on religion. It was a brutal economic competition fought with navies, pirates, and blockades. Similarly, the epic voyages of Vasco da Gama and Christopher Columbus were not merely exercises in exploration. They were state-sponsored military commercial missions, explicitly designed to bypass the Ottoman and Venetian monopolies on the spice and silk trades. When the Portuguese arrived in the Indian Ocean, they did not seek to integrate peacefully into the existing network of Arab, Indian, and Malay merchants. They used their superior naval artillery to impose a system of violence and coercion, seizing key ports like Goa and Hormuz, and demanding that all merchant ships purchase costly cartazes or passports to trade. They aimed not to join the system but to dominate and militarize it, turning peaceful emporiums into fortified outposts of a seaborne empire. This pattern of conflict extended far beyond the sea. The Mongol conquests, while devastatingly destructive, were also followed by a conscious effort to secure and protect the Silk Road under the Pax Mongolica, because the Mongols understood that a safe and functioning trade network was the most reliable source of tax revenue for their massive empire. Even the famous Crusades, framed in religious terms, had a powerful commercial undercurrent, as Italian merchant cities used them as an opportunity to establish trading bases in the Levant and gain preferential access to the goods of the East. The desire for trade did not just cause occasional skirmishes, it shaped the geopolitical map of the world, determining which empires would rise to global dominance and which would fade into obscurity. The promise of commercial wealth justified immense military expenditure, fueled decades of warfare, and led to the subjugation of entire regions. The glittering silks and aromatic spices that graced the tables of the wealthy were often paid for not just in gold but in blood. This darker legacy is an inseparable part of the story. To only speak of the cultural and technological exchanges is to tell a sanitized, incomplete version of history. The same connections that allowed for the flowering of human creativity also created pathways for pandemic death, systems of brutal exploitation, and engines of perpetual conflict. Acknowledging this stark duality is not to diminish the achievements of the ancient traders and explorers, but to understand their world, and by extension our own, in its full, complex, and often uncomfortable reality. Progress and profit have always been shadowed by profound human cost. Now, consider the very words we use to discuss this history. The story of ancient trade is not just written in artifacts and ruins, it is embedded in the language you and I are speaking right now. Every time we ask for a cup of coffee, sprinkle sugar on our food, or describe the color of an orange, we are unwittingly speaking the linguistic legacy of those ancient trade routes. The need for commerce forced people who spoke utterly different tongues to find a way to communicate, and in doing so, they didn't just exchange goods, they traded the very building blocks of language itself, creating new dialects, spreading dominant tongues, and leaving a permanent mark on how the world speaks. The most immediate solution to the problem of cross-cultural trade was the emergence of lingua francas. This term, which is itself Italian for Frankish tongue, originally referred to a mixed language used in the medieval Mediterranean. But the concept is universal, a common bridge language that allows people with different native languages to conduct business. One of the earliest and most powerful examples was Aramaic. It began as the language of a relatively small group of people in what is now Syria, but its simple, easy-to-learn alphabet and structure made it incredibly useful. As the Assyrian and later the vast Persian Achaemenid Empire expanded, they faced a monumental administrative challenge: how to govern dozens of different peoples from Egypt to India, all speaking a bewildering array of languages. The solution was to adopt Aramaic as the official language of bureaucracy and trade. Imperial decrees, tax records, and commercial contracts were written in Aramaic and disseminated across the empire. Caravans traveling from the Levant to Central Asia carried the language with them, and it became the common tongue of merchants, diplomats, and administrators from the borders of Greece to the deserts of Afghanistan. For centuries, even after the fall of the Persian Empire, Aramaic persisted as the dominant language of trade and daily life throughout the Near East, and it was likely the primary language spoken by Jesus of Nazareth. Its success demonstrates how economic and administrative utility could elevate a local dialect into a global language, a pattern that would repeat itself again and again. Centuries later, a similar story unfolded with the rise of Arabic. While its initial spread was tied to the rapid military expansion of Islam in the 7th and 8th centuries, its endurance and deep-rooted adoption across a vast swath of the world were overwhelmingly due to trade. As Muslim merchants established a continuous economic network stretching from the Iberian Peninsula to the islands of Indonesia, Arabic became the language of commerce, law, and high culture. A trader from Morocco could travel to the markets of Oman or the port cities of the Swahili coast and find business partners who all used Arabic for contracts and correspondence. This created an immense zone of economic and intellectual exchange where scholars in Cordoba, Cairo, and Baghdad could all read the same scientific texts and philosophical works, written in the same language. The adoption of Arabic did not always erase local languages. Instead, it often existed alongside them, a language of the elite, the marketplace, and the mosque, profoundly influencing local vocabularies and scripts. This process of linguistic fusion created entirely new languages, and one of the most striking examples is Swahili. On the East African coast, a vibrant maritime trade had existed for millennia, connecting the interior of Africa with the wider Indian Ocean world. Arab and Persian merchants established trading colonies there, interacting intensely with the local Bantu-speaking populations. Out of this sustained contact, a new language was born, Swahili. Its grammatical structure and core vocabulary are fundamentally Bantu, but it is overflowing with loanwords from Arabic, particularly for terms related to commerce, law, religion, and seafaring. Words like sufuria for pot from the Arabic sufra and pesa for money from the Arabic falsa are woven into its very fabric. Swahili emerged as the perfect linguistic tool for its environment. It was the language of the dhow sailors, the port officials, and the merchants negotiating for ivory, gold, and slaves. It allowed a merchant from Gujarat to communicate with a trader from the African interior, facilitating one of the most dynamic economic zones in the medieval world. This was not a language imposed by conquest, but one that grew organically from the daily necessities of commerce, a living testament to how trade can act as a linguistic crucible. Beyond the spoken word, the practical demands of business drove one of the most important revolutions in human history, the development and standardization of writing. Long-distance trade required reliable record-keeping. A merchant needed to track complex transactions, record debts, and draft binding contracts that could be understood by partners who might be thousands of miles away. This bureaucratic pressure was a powerful engine for literacy. The earliest known writing system, cuneiform in Mesopotamia, evolved from a system of clay tokens used to account for agricultural goods. The Phoenicians, master traders of the Mediterranean, developed a streamlined phonetic alphabet that was far easier to learn than the complex syllabic systems of Egypt or Mesopotamia. This Phoenician script was so practical for commercial record-keeping that it was adopted and adapted by the Greeks, who added vowels, and it eventually became the ancestor of the Latin alphabet you are reading now. Every invoice, every bill of lading, every partnership agreement pushed societies toward greater literacy and forced the standardization of written language, creating the tools that would later be used to write literature, history, and law. And finally, we can hear the echoes of these ancient exchanges in our own kitchens and daily conversations. The global journey of commodities is fossilized in the words we use for them. Take sugar. Our word comes to us through a long linguistic chain, from the Sanskrit sakara to the Persian shakar to the Arabic sakar, into medieval Latin as sakarum, and then into Old French as sucker, before finally entering English as sugar. Each step in that chain represents a handoff along a trade route. Coffee has a similarly rich journey. It likely originates from the Kaffa region of Ethiopia, but the word we use comes from the Arabic kahwa, which referred to a type of wine, and then passed into Turkish as kahve before entering European languages. Even the word orange traces a colorful path from the Sanskrit n-a-macron r a letter 1e4, 5g to the Persian narang, to the Arabic naranj, into Italian as arancia, and finally to English. These words are not just labels, they are linguistic souvenirs, each one a tiny piece of history that reveals the path a product took from its origin to your home. They prove that language is not a static, isolated system, but a dynamic, living entity that has been shaped, enriched, and transformed by thousands of years of commercial contact. In the end, the cargo of words has been one of the most enduring and personal legacies of ancient trade, shaping our thoughts and our conversations in ways we rarely even notice. But how can we be so sure that these sprawling, almost mythical networks truly crisscrossed the ancient world? How do we move from grand stories to concrete, verifiable facts? The answer lies not in dusty scrolls alone, but in the very soil, in the fragments and residues that archaeologists patiently piece together to reconstruct a global past. Imagine a single, solitary Roman coin, minted with the profile of an emperor in the forum of a city like Rome or Antioch. Now picture that same coin, worn smooth from countless hands, discovered in a hoard buried in a farmer's field in southern India. That coin is not just a piece of metal, it is a silent, powerful witness. It tells a story of a merchant, perhaps from the bustling port of Alexandria, who sailed across the Indian Ocean, his ship laden with wine and glassware. In a market on the Coromandel coast, he sold his goods and received a mix of local currencies and this Roman denarius in exchange. For some reason, that coin was never spent again. It was saved, maybe lost, and finally buried for safekeeping, waiting nearly 2,000 years to testify to a connection that history books could only speculate about. This is not an isolated find. From Roman amphorae that once held olive oil and wine found in the ruins of Chinese ports, to intricate Chinese silk preserved in the dry sands of an Egyptian tomb, these objects are the physical proof of a world in conversation. Even the most perishable of goods leave their mark. Scientists analyzing the crusty residues inside pots from a medieval shipwreck off the coast of Europe have detected the chemical signature of black pepper, a spice that grew only in the distant hills of India's Malabar coast. That humble pot scrubbed the dinner plates of a wealthy European family, and its residue is a molecular receipt for a transaction that spanned half the globe. Beyond the traveling artifacts themselves, the very bones of ancient cities map the flow of trade with stunning clarity. Archaeologists don't just dig for objects, they read the landscape. The layout of a settlement can reveal its economic heartbeat. Take the magnificent ruins of Palmyra, an oasis city in the Syrian desert. Its grand colonnaded street wasn't just for show. It was a processional way for caravans leading directly to the agora, the central market. Excavations reveal specialized quarters, a district for dyeing fabrics, another for metalworking, and the unmistakable, sprawling complexes of caravanserais on the city's outskirts. These were not just inns, they were the ancient equivalent of modern truck stops and free trade zones combined. Their large central courtyards could hold hundreds of camels, while the surrounding rooms provided lodging, storage, and space for merchants to display their wares. The presence of these structures, repeated like a rhythmic pattern at intervals of a day's journey along the Silk Road and other routes, charts the network itself. They are the fossilized infrastructure of globalization, proving that this was a systematic, organized, and heavily trafficked system, not a series of rare, adventurous expeditions. In port cities from Ostia in Italy to Lothal in India, we find the same telltale signs: massive warehouses for storing grain, wine, and marble right next to the docks, dedicated market squares with shops still containing scales and standard weights, and inscriptions in multiple languages detailing tariffs and customs duties. The city itself becomes a text, and its streets, buildings, and zoning tell the story of its role in a vast, interconnected economy. The detective work of modern archaeology has grown even more sophisticated with the advent of powerful scientific techniques that allow us to ask new questions of old objects. One of the most revolutionary is isotope analysis. Think of it as a kind of chemical passport embedded within an artifact. The food and water a person consumes, or the materials an object is made from, contain unique isotopic signatures that reflect the local geology and environment. By analyzing the strontium and oxygen isotopes in the tooth enamel of a skeleton found in a Roman cemetery in Britain, scientists can determine that the individual actually grew up in North Africa. This single piece of data transforms an anonymous skeleton into a migrant, a traveler, or a soldier who moved across the empire, a human illustration of the mobility these networks enabled. This technique can be applied to inanimate objects as well. The precise origin of silver in ancient coins can be pinpointed, revealing intricate patterns of bullion flow from Spanish mines to markets in the Middle East. The composition of glass beads found in a Viking grave in Scandinavia can be traced back to a specific workshop in Egypt or Mesopotamia. Even everyday items like millstones, used for grinding grain, can be sourced to specific quarries hundreds of miles away, proving that local communities were connected to distant industrial centers. These scientific methods peel back the layers of time, allowing us to see the incredible journeys of seemingly ordinary objects. A simple clay pot found in a village in Central Asia might have been made locally, but the wine stains inside it could be chemically linked to vineyards in the Mediterranean. It reveals that a farmer living a seemingly isolated life was drinking wine that had crossed deserts and mountains to reach his table. This transforms our understanding of the ancient world from a collection of separate civilizations into a deeply integrated community where the global was already local. Each excavation, each carefully sifted layer of soil, adds another crucial piece to this immense, sprawling puzzle. A shipwreck discovered off the coast of Indonesia, its hull filled with Chinese Celadon porcelain and Thai ceramics, confirms the vibrant maritime trade of the Srivijaya Empire. A cache of letters written by Jewish merchants in the Cairo Geniza details their business dealings across the Indian Ocean, providing a personal, human voice to the mechanics of long-distance trade. A single peppercorn found in the nostril of the mummified Ramesses II in Egypt pushes back the timeline of direct contact between the Mediterranean and India by centuries. These are not disconnected curiosities. They are individual data points that, when connected, form a clear and undeniable picture of ancient globalization. They confirm the scale, the sophistication, and the sheer volume of exchange that was taking place for millennia. The ground beneath our feet is not just dirt and rock. It is a vast, unorganized archive holding the receipts, the shipping manifests, and the personal effects of history's greatest and most enduring enterprise, the human drive to connect, to trade, and to explore. Every time an archaeologist's trowel uncovers a coin from a far-off land or a seed from a foreign fruit, they are not just finding an artifact, they are reconnecting a thread in the magnificent, invisible web that first bound our world together. The same merchants who carried spices and silks were also, in a very real sense, storytellers, and the incredible realities they witnessed on their journeys were often so astonishing that they could only be processed by transforming them into myth. The line between a trade ledger and a book of legends was remarkably thin, because the human mind has always used the power of story to make sense of the unfamiliar and the economically irresistible. Consider one of the most famous diplomatic encounters in the biblical tradition, the Queen of Sheba's lavish visit to the wise King Solomon in Jerusalem. The Bible describes her arriving with a very specific and enormous caravan, one loaded with camels carrying spices, great quantities of gold, and precious stones. This wasn't just a social call, it was a state visit with profound economic underpinnings. Sheba was likely the powerful trading kingdom of Saba, located in what is now Yemen, a civilization whose entire wealth was built on its absolute monopoly over the production of frankincense and myrrh. Solomon's Israel, on the other hand, controlled key land routes to the Mediterranean. The Queen's journey, shrouded in the language of testing Solomon's wisdom and exchanging gifts, bears all the hallmarks of a high-stakes trade negotiation. It was an effort to forge a political and commercial alliance, ensuring the smooth and profitable flow of Arabian incense to the wealthy markets of the Levant and beyond. The legendary wealth they exchanged, the gold, the gems, the spices, was the very substance of their economies. Over centuries, the raw economic facts of this mutually beneficial partnership were polished by storytellers into a tale of dazzling splendor and romance, a narrative that gave a timeless, divine sheen to what was at its heart a brilliant business deal. The myth preserved the memory of the connection long after the specific trade agreements had been forgotten, proving that the most enduring contracts are sometimes written not on parchment, but in the collective imagination. On the other side of the ancient world, a different kind of legendary quest was taking shape, one that similarly masks a bedrock of economic desire. The Greek myth of Jason and the Argonauts, with their epic voyage on the ship Argo to retrieve the golden fleece from the far-off kingdom of Colchis, reads like a pure adventure. A magical fleece made of gold, guarded by a dragon, in a land at the very edge of the known world. It is the stuff of pure fantasy. Yet, when you strip away the mythological layers, a very plausible historical core emerges. Colchis was a real place located on the eastern coast of the Black Sea in modern-day Georgia, a region famously rich in gold. The local people had a unique, and to outsiders, a seemingly magical method for collecting it. They would lay sheepskins in the turbulent, gold-bearing mountain rivers. The fleece would act as a filter, trapping the tiny flakes of alluvial gold in its thick wool. To a Greek sailor seeing this for the first time, the sight of a sheepskin glittering with trapped gold particles would indeed look like a golden fleece. The entire legend of Jason's journey can be interpreted as a mythological memory of the earliest Greek explorations into the Black Sea, a dangerous but potentially lucrative venture to secure direct access to this precious metal, bypassing the middlemen who controlled the overland routes. The story encapsulates the very real perils of early exploration: the treacherous clashing rocks at the Bosporus, the hostile barbarian tribes, the sheer psychological terror of sailing beyond the familiar Mediterranean, and translates them into the language of mythic obstacles, clashing Symplegades, warrior women, and enchanting sirens. The quest for the Golden Fleece wasn't just a hero's errand for glory. It was a poetic representation of the immense risks and rewards that drove Greek colonization and trade expansion. The myth was a way for the Greeks to process their own daring, to frame their commercial ambitions as a heroic destiny, turning merchants and prospectors into the demigods of their national epic. This blending of fact and fantasy only intensified in the later medieval period, when the fruits of trade became even more common in European markets, yet their origins remained shrouded in utter mystery. A text like the Travels of Sir John Mandeville, which was wildly popular throughout Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries, is a perfect example of this phenomenon. It was presented as the true account of an English knight's journey to the Far East, and while it contained some genuine geographical information gleaned from real travelers, it was largely a work of fantastical fiction. Its pages are populated with bizarre and wondrous races, people with giant ears they could wrap around themselves like blankets, others with no heads and faces on their chests, and tribes who lived on the smell of apples alone. To the modern reader, this seems like pure nonsense, but for a medieval European who had never traveled beyond their own village, it was a plausible explanation for the mind-boggling reality of global trade. If pepper and cloves and silk were arriving from places so distant they were literally off the map, then why couldn't those places also be inhabited by fantastical creatures? The strange goods themselves seem to demand a strange and miraculous origin story. The Travels also describe the court of the Great Khan in Cathay in terms of unimaginable splendor, with palaces of gold and pearls and rivers flowing with gems. This, too, was a magnification of a real economic truth: the immense, almost mythical wealth of the Mongol Empire and the Chinese courts that so dazzled actual travelers like Marco Polo. The legend of Prester John, a fabulously wealthy Christian king ruling a paradise-like kingdom somewhere in the vastness of either Asia or Africa, was another such trade-born myth. It was a fantasy that sustained generations of explorers and missionaries, driven by the hope of finding a powerful ally and accessing the source of the luxuries that passed through so many hands before reaching them. These stories were not simply lies, they were the necessary cognitive framework for a Europe that was economically connected to a global system, but still geographically and culturally isolated from its centers. The goods were real, but the world that produced them had to be a land of wonders. The human imagination, confronted with the tangible evidence of a world far wider than it could conceive, filled the blank spaces on the map with monsters and miracles, creating a sense of awe and mystery that, in its own way, was just as powerful a driver of exploration as the desire for profit itself. Now, let's turn our attention to something that affects every single one of us multiple times a day: the food we eat. The story of ancient trade is not confined to luxury goods and abstract ideas. It is written in the very plants that feed the world. Long before the famous Columbian exchange linked the Americas with the rest of the globe, a quieter but equally transformative agricultural revolution was taking place across the ancient world. Think of it as a slow-motion Columbian exchange for the Old World, a centuries-long process where staple crops, fruits, and vegetables were steadily transferred from their places of origin to new environments, forever changing what people grew, what they ate, and ultimately how civilizations themselves developed. This was a biological exchange with profound consequences, where the most valuable cargo wasn't silk or spice, but a simple seed. Consider the journey of citrus fruits. Today, a lemon or an orange seems quintessentially Mediterranean, the very symbol of sunny Italian coastlines and Greek groves, but their story begins thousands of miles away, in the lush, tropical forests of Southeast Asia and Northeast India. Wild ancestors of these fruits, bitter, thick-skinned, and full of seeds, were first cultivated there. It was along the winding tracks of the Silk Road and the bustling sea lanes of the Indian Ocean that these exotic treasures began their westward trek. Arab traders played a particularly crucial role, carrying sour oranges, lemons, and citrons into the Middle East and North Africa. They recognized their value not just as an occasional treat, but for their practical uses. The high acidity of lemons, for instance, was a powerful preservative and a key ingredient in many new culinary traditions. As these fruits reached the Mediterranean, they found a climate that was, in many ways, even more perfect for their cultivation than their original home. The sunny, dry summers and mild, wet winters of regions like Sicily and Andalusia were ideal. Through careful selection and breeding, farmers slowly developed the sweeter, juicier varieties we know today. This wasn't a simple transplant, it was a process of adaptation and improvement. The introduction of citrus did more than just add a new flavor to the diet. The high vitamin C content in these fruits, though not understood at the time, helped combat scurvy and other nutritional deficiencies, contributing to the overall health of populations around the Mediterranean basin. A simple piece of fruit traveling from a jungle in Asia to an orchard in Spain became a cornerstone of public health and culinary identity, transforming the landscape and the dinner plate in one fell swoop. This flow of agricultural knowledge was never just a one-way street from east to west. At the very same time, foundational crops from the ancient Near East were moving in the opposite direction, eastward into the vast expanse of Asia. Wheat and barley, the grasses that fueled the rise of the first great civilizations in Mesopotamia, began their own long journeys. Carried by traders and migrating peoples, these grains slowly spread across Central Asia and into China. This created a fascinating culinary divergence. While rice remained the undisputed staple of southern and eastern China, the introduction of wheat provided a crucial new source of calories and versatility in the drier, colder north. This is why northern Chinese cuisine is famous for its wheat-based dishes, noodles, dumplings, and steamed buns, while the south remains the domain of rice. The movement of the grapevine tells a similar story of cultural fusion. Originating in the Caucasus region, grape cultivation for wine spread with Phoenician and Greek traders throughout the Mediterranean. But it also traveled east with merchants on the Silk Road, reaching China by at least the Han Dynasty. While wine never displaced rice, beer, or tea as the dominant beverage in East Asia, its presence is recorded in courtly life, and the technology of viticulture was added to the region's vast agricultural repertoire. These exchanges demonstrate that ancient trade created a kind of global pantry, where civilizations could pick and choose from a shared menu of domesticated plants, adopting and adapting them to fit their own environmental conditions and cultural preferences. The world's agricultural map was being redrawn not by politicians, but by the slow, persistent movement of merchants and migrants. The consequences of these crop transfers were often dramatic, reshaping the very demographic and physical landscape of entire regions. The introduction of a new, high-yield or highly nutritious crop could trigger a population boom. Imagine a society relying on a limited set of local grains. The arrival of a new staple, like certain hardy varieties of rice from India into Southeast Asia, or new strains of wheat into Europe, could provide a more reliable and abundant food source. With a more secure food supply, populations could grow, villages could expand into towns, and societies could support larger, more specialized non-farming populations. Soldiers, artisans, and bureaucrats who could, in turn, build more complex states and empires. This agricultural enrichment was a silent engine of historical change, providing the caloric fuel for civilization's greatest achievements. But this new agricultural interconnectedness had a dark side, one that foreshadowed the economic inequalities of our modern world. The same trade networks that distributed food staples also created a powerful demand for luxury cash crops. The most infamous example is sugar. Originally domesticated in New Guinea, sugar cane was first cultivated on a large scale in India. The knowledge of its processing spread slowly westward with Islamic expansion, reaching the Mediterranean islands of Cyprus and Sicily. But it was the demand for sugar in Europe, initially as a rare medicine and spice, that transformed it into an economic monster. To meet this demand, European powers would later establish vast, brutal plantation systems in the Atlantic islands and the Americas, systems that were built on the backbone of the transatlantic slave trade. The pattern was set much earlier, however. The intense focus on a single, highly profitable crop like sugar could reshape entire societies, concentrating land ownership, demanding immense amounts of labor, and making regions dangerously dependent on a volatile global market. The same was true for cotton, another ancient crop from the Indus Valley that became a global commodity. The desire for cotton textiles, traded from India to Rome and beyond, encouraged monoculture, the dedication of vast swaths of land to a single plant. This could lead to soil exhaustion, deforestation, and a loss of agricultural biodiversity, as farmers abandoned growing a variety of foods for their own community in favor of a crop that could be sold for cash on the other side of the world. The very connections that provided food security for some could create profound vulnerability and exploitation for others, a tension that remains at the heart of our globalized food system today. When we sit down to a meal today, we are, in a very real sense, dining in the world's greatest museum of ancient history. The food on your plate is a living archive of thousands of years of trade, migration, and cultural exchange. That morning coffee, with its beans first cultivated in the highlands of Ethiopia and popularized in the Arab world, is a direct descendant of the medieval coffeehouses of Cairo and Constantinople. The tomato in your salad, though a later arrival from the Americas, follows a path blazed by earlier trade in other nightshades like eggplant, which originated in India and traveled to the Middle East and Europe. The spices in your curry, cumin from the Eastern Mediterranean, coriander from Southern Europe, black pepper from India, represent a culinary map of the entire Indian Ocean world. Even something as seemingly simple as a slice of bread tells a story of ancient connections. The wheat in its flour has ancestors in the Fertile Crescent. The yeast used to leaven it has cousins in ancient Egyptian breweries, and the practice of baking in an oven was refined and spread across continents. Our global cuisine is a testament to humanity's incredible ingenuity and adaptability. It shows that our ancestors were not just passive recipients of their local environment. They were active curators of a global botanical collection, constantly experimenting, crossbreeding, and integrating new flavors into their lives. The interconnectedness we experience today, where we can eat sushi in Brazil or a hamburger in Tokyo, is not a sudden modern phenomenon. It is the latest chapter in a story that began when a trader, thousands of years ago, packed a few rare seeds or a cutting from a fruit tree into his saddlebag, carrying the taste of home to a distant land, and in doing so, forever changed the culinary destiny of us all. The goods that traveled these ancient highways were not merely objects of commerce. They were often accompanied by something far more profound, a spiritual cargo that would ultimately reshape the very soul of humanity. The bustling trade routes, those arteries of material exchange, doubled as the world's most effective and enduring channels for the spread of faith. It was along these paths that the great world religions embarked on their own epic journeys, carried not just by zealous missionaries, but by the merchants and travelers for whom faith was a natural companion to their worldly pursuits. This was a transformation that moved at the speed of commerce, forever altering the spiritual landscape of entire continents. Consider the extraordinary journey of Buddhism out of its birthplace in northeastern India. For centuries after the Buddha's passing, his teachings remained largely confined to the Indian subcontinent. But as the Silk Road began to pulse with life, it offered a perfect pathway for this monastic, contemplative faith to travel. Buddhist monks, recognizing the safety and infrastructure provided by the merchant caravans, began to walk alongside them. These were not just pilgrims, they were strategic ambassadors. They established monastic communities and carved magnificent cave temples at crucial oasis towns like Dunhuang, which became way stations not just for the body but for the soul. Here, in these echoing grottos, the fusion of cultures is visible on the very walls. The serene faces of the Buddha and the flowing lines of the bodhisattvas show clear influences from the Greco-Roman art that had traveled east with Alexander the Great's legacy, blended with Persian motifs and a distinctly Chinese aesthetic sensibility. This was not a faith imposed by conquest, but one that slowly, patiently, and artfully integrated itself into new cultures. It adapted its message, emphasizing aspects of its philosophy that resonated with local Taoist and Confucian traditions in China, and in doing so, it transformed from an Indian philosophical system into a truly pan-Asian religion. Its journey from the Ganges Plain to the courts of Japan mapped precisely along the lines of commercial exchange. Across the Mediterranean world, a different faith was finding its footing on the back of another powerful network. Christianity, born in the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire, initially spread through the intimate connections of the Jewish diaspora. But its real breakout moment came when it hitched a ride on the unparalleled infrastructure of the Roman Empire itself. The famous Roman roads, built for legions and administrators, also carried merchants, and with them the new Christian message. The relative peace and stability of the empire, the famous Pax Romana, allowed for safe and unprecedented movement. Early Christian evangelists like Paul of Tarsus traveled along these established sea and land routes, moving from city to city, often finding their first audiences among the communities of merchants and artisans in major urban centers like Ephesus, Corinth, and Rome itself. Later, as the Roman Empire in the West crumbled, the faith's expansion continued through the thriving maritime trade of the Mediterranean. Syrian Christian merchants, for instance, established communities in port cities from Alexandria to Marseille, and their churches became familiar landmarks, signaling a persistent and growing presence. This maritime network eventually carried Christianity northward to the Slavic peoples, where traders and missionaries from Byzantium followed the river routes that were also vital commercial arteries, weaving the new faith into the very fabric of emerging states like Kievan Rus. The story of Christianity's spread is inextricably linked to the map of Roman commerce, proving that a faith can travel as efficiently on a merchant galley as on the sandals of an apostle. Then, with breathtaking speed, came the rise of Islam in the 7th century. While its initial expansion was military, its enduring and deep-rooted establishment across a vast swath of the globe was overwhelmingly a story of trade. Muslim merchants were the faith's most effective and persistent ambassadors. As the caliphates unified the Middle East and North Africa, they created a vast, integrated economic zone where a Muslim merchant from Damascus could travel to the Maghreb or the Sind with a shared legal system and a common language of commerce, Arabic. But their reach extended far beyond the borders of the caliphate. In the Indian Ocean, Muslim traders from Arabia and Persia mastered the monsoon winds, establishing diaspora communities all along the coasts of East Africa, India, and as far as the Spice Islands of Southeast Asia. They did not arrive with armies, but with goods and a reputation for honesty and sophisticated business practices. In these foreign ports, the first permanent structure they would often build was not a fortified warehouse, but a mosque. These mosques served as community centers, places of worship, and clear, physical declarations of their identity. Their presence attracted the attention of local rulers, who were often impressed by the merchants' wealth, literacy, and connections to a wider world. The conversion of powerful trading cities on the Swahili coast, or of rulers in the Malay archipelago, was frequently a pragmatic decision, a way to integrate into this prosperous and far-reaching network. The spiritual appeal of the message was undeniable, but its vehicle was unequivocally commerce. This same pattern unfolded along the Trans-Saharan routes, where Berber and Arab merchants introduced Islam to the empires of West Africa. The faith slowly permeated the courts of Ghana and later Mali, carried not by the sword, but by the camel caravan, its adoption by emperors like Mansa Musa, transforming their realms into major centers of Islamic scholarship and fully integrating them into the intellectual and economic life of the Afro-Eurasian world. This process of religious exchange, however, was not always a serene and peaceful absorption. The spread of faith along trade routes could be a source of tension and violent conflict. Competition between merchants of different religions could flare into riots, and the close association of a faith with a particular trading power could make it a target. The Crusades, for instance, were in part a violent reaction to the Islamic control of the holy sites in Jerusalem, but they were also deeply entangled with the commercial ambitions of Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa, who saw an opportunity to seize a greater share of the lucrative Eastern trade. The line between a holy war and a trade war was often blurry. Furthermore, the introduction of a new, universalizing religion could destabilize local social structures and challenge ancient animist beliefs, leading to internal strife and the suppression of indigenous traditions. The spiritual map was being redrawn, but the ink was sometimes mixed with blood. Yet, despite these conflicts, the enduring legacy is one of profound and permanent transformation. The beliefs held by billions of people today, from a Buddhist in Japan to a Christian in Nigeria to a Muslim in Indonesia, were not formed in isolation. Their very presence in those regions is a direct consequence of the commercial itineraries followed by traders centuries ago. The merchant, often viewed as a figure concerned only with profit, was in fact one of history's most influential, if unwitting, evangelists. They carried their faith in their hearts and built its houses of worship with their wealth, creating a network of spiritual way stations that long outlasted the empires that built the roads. The goods they traded have been consumed, the currencies they used have been melted down, but the religions they helped to spread continue to define civilizations, guide lives, and shape the moral and ethical contours of our modern world. The story of ancient trade is not just one of merchants and markets. It is also the story of emperors and armies, of states that understood that controlling the flow of commerce was the most direct path to building and sustaining immense power. Across continents and centuries, the ambition to command trade routes became a primary driver of imperial expansion, shaping the borders of the ancient world and determining which civilizations would rise to global dominance. Consider the relentless growth of the Roman Empire. While its legions are famous for their military discipline and conquest, their campaigns were often guided by a very practical economic logic. The empire's very lifeblood depended on a constant, reliable flow of essential resources from its provinces. Perhaps the most critical of these was grain. The city of Rome itself, with a population that swelled to over 1 million people, could not possibly feed itself with the agricultural output of its surrounding Italian countryside. The answer lay in North Africa. After the annexation of Egypt as a province following the defeat of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, the fertile Nile Delta became the breadbasket of the empire. A massive, state-subsidized fleet of grain ships operated a virtual conveyor belt across the Mediterranean, carrying millions of tons of Egyptian wheat to the port of Ostia. This was not a simple commercial operation, it was a matter of state security. The emperor himself took a direct interest because a disruption in the grain supply meant hunger, riots, and a direct threat to his rule. The famous phrase "bread and circuses" acknowledges that the stability of the empire rested on its ability to feed the restless urban masses of the capital. But the Roman appetite extended far beyond mere sustenance. The empire's elite developed an insatiable taste for the luxuries of the East: silks from China, spices from India, pearls from the Persian Gulf, and incense from Arabia. The problem was that Rome consistently imported far more than it exported, leading to a massive, worrying drain of gold and silver bullion to pay for these goods. Roman writers like Pliny the Elder lamented this financial hemorrhage, estimating that vast sums were lost to the East every year. This economic imbalance was a powerful, albeit indirect, motivator for expansion and control. By securing the land routes through the Levant and the maritime routes through the Red Sea, the empire could better manage, tax, and protect this vital flow of wealth, ensuring that the luxuries that defined Roman aristocratic life continued to arrive, even as the treasury worked to stem the outflow of precious metal. The revenue generated from taxing this trade was astronomical, funding the legions that guarded the frontiers, the vast bureaucracy that administered the provinces, and the monumental architecture, the aqueducts, temples, and amphitheaters that proclaimed the glory of Rome to the world. Trade was not a side effect of Roman power, it was one of its essential supporting pillars. In stark contrast to the centralized, bureaucratic Roman model, the Mongol Empire presents a fascinating and often misunderstood case. For centuries, the steppe nomads had been portrayed by their settled neighbors as mindless destroyers, a whirlwind of violence that left only ashes in its wake. While their conquests were undoubtedly brutal, the Mongol approach to the territories they subjugated reveals a far more sophisticated and pragmatic understanding of power. Once the initial shock of conquest was over, the Mongol Khans, particularly under the rule of Genghis Khan's successors, realized that a dead empire could not pay tribute and a ruined trade route could not generate wealth. They actively set about creating the conditions for what historians call the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace. This was a period stretching from the mid-13th to the mid-14th century, when the entire breadth of Eurasia, from the borders of Korea to the gates of Hungary, was unified under a single, albeit loose, political authority. The Mongols ruthlessly suppressed the petty warfare and banditry that had plagued the Silk Road for centuries. they established a system of official way stations known as the Yam that functioned as a continental relay system. Fresh horses, provisions, and guides were available at regular intervals, allowing merchants, messengers, and diplomats to travel from one end of the empire to the other with unprecedented speed and safety. A traveler could journey from the Black Sea to Beijing carrying a golden tablet known as a paisa, which acted as a passport and safe conduct pass, demanding assistance and protection from all local authorities. This security supercharged the Silk Road. For the first and only time in history, a single merchant could potentially do business from the Mediterranean to the Pacific under the guarantee of one imperial power. The flow of goods, ideas, and people reached a fever pitch. It was this very Pax Mongolica that enabled the legendary journey of Marco Polo, a Venetian merchant who spent decades in the service of Kublai Khan. The immense wealth the Mongols extracted from taxing this revitalized trade financed their courts, their further military campaigns, and their patronage of artisans and scholars from all over the known world. The Mongol Empire, therefore, was not built to destroy commerce, but to master and monopolize it on a continental scale, proving that even the most fearsome horse lords understood that the smooth flow of caravans was far more valuable than the piles of loot from a sacked city. While land-based empires fought over caravan routes, other powers emerged whose dominion was measured not in acres of territory, but in control of the sea lanes. In Southeast Asia, the Srivijaya Empire rose to become a legendary maritime power, not by conquering vast stretches of inland jungle, but by mastering a single, crucial geographical feature, the Strait of Malacca. This narrow passage between the Malay Peninsula and the island of Sumatra is one of the most strategic choke points in the entire world. It is the shortest sea route between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. For any ship traveling from the spice ports of the Moluccas or the wealthy markets of China to the trading hubs of India and the Middle East, passing through the Strait of Malacca was essential. The rulers of Srivijaya, based in the rich port city of Palembang on Sumatra, built their entire empire on this simple, unshakable geographical fact. They did not need to build a large territorial empire. They simply needed a powerful navy to control the strait. Srivijayan kings positioned their fleets to monitor all shipping, compelling every vessel that passed to call at their ports. Here, the goods were unloaded, warehoused, and taxed. The empire became the essential middleman, the indispensable broker for all trade between East and West. It grew fantastically wealthy not from producing goods, but from facilitating their movement, skimming a percentage from the greatest commercial flow on the planet. The Chinese Buddhist monk Yijing, who visited Srivijaya in the 7th century on his way to study in India, described it as a major center of Buddhist learning, attracting thousands of scholars. This cultural flourishing was directly funded by the profits of its maritime toll booth. The Srivijaya Empire is a perfect example of a thalassocracy, a sea-based empire. Its power was invisible on a map of land borders, but on a map of trade winds and ocean currents. It was a colossal superpower, its influence stretching across the waves for centuries, all thanks to its ruthless and brilliant control of a single, vital strait. The common thread running through these diverse empires, Roman, Mongol, and Srivijayan, was the transformative power of trade revenue. The ability to consistently tax commerce provided ancient states with a financial engine of unprecedented power. This was not sporadic plunder from a successful war, which was a one-time windfall. This was a predictable, renewable, and ever-growing source of income. This steady stream of wealth allowed states to professionalize their armies. Instead of relying on seasonal peasant levies, they could pay full-time soldiers, equip them with standardized weapons and armor, and maintain them in the field year-round. This was the foundation of the legendary Roman legions, a professional military machine that could campaign for decades far from home. The same revenue stream funded the complex bureaucracies needed to administer vast territories. An empire cannot be run by soldiers alone. It needs tax collectors, scribes, judges, and provincial governors. A salaried civil service that can enforce laws, collect revenue, and maintain order. This administrative class was paid for by the tariffs on silk, the duties on pepper, and the taxes on incense. Furthermore, this surplus capital was what made monumental architecture possible. The great projects that defined a civilization and proclaimed its greatness to the world, the Roman Colosseum, the massive Buddhist stupas of Srivijaya, the pleasure domes of the Mongol Khans, were not just expressions of artistic vision. They were powerful statements of financial and political power, built with the profits extracted from the global marketplace. Trade, therefore, was the invisible architect of the ancient world's political landscape. It determined which cities would become glorious capitals and which would fade into obscurity. It directed the march of armies and defined the borders of empires. The desire to control the channels of commerce fueled imperial ambition on a global scale, forging connections of power and profit that would shape the destiny of nations for millennia to come. But to truly understand the engine of this ancient global economy, we need to look beyond the spices and silks, beyond the caravans and ships, and focus on something far more fundamental, the very lifeblood that pumped through these networks, giving them vitality and power. Think of the mining and movement of precious metals as the cardiovascular system of the ancient world. Just as your heart circulates blood to every part of your body, delivering oxygen and nutrients, the relentless flow of gold, silver, and copper circulated value and energy to every corner of the interconnected continents, creating a single, pulsing financial organism. This was a system of astonishing scale and sophistication, where the discovery of a new silver mine in the mountains of Greece could influence the price of grain in Egypt, and the gold dust weighed out in a West African trading post could end up minted into a coin that paid a Roman soldier on the damp frontier of Britain. The story begins with the raw material itself, drawn from the earth in locations that became legendary. From the sun-scorched mines of West Africa, in empires like Ghana and Mali, came a seemingly endless river of gold. This was not mined in deep shafts by vast corporations, but often panned from riverbeds or extracted from shallow pits, its dust and nuggets carefully gathered and transported north across the Sahara. From the rocky hills of Spain and the mines of Lorient in Greece came vast quantities of silver, a metal almost as coveted as gold, and from the island of Cyprus came copper, the namesake of the metal so crucial for making the bronze tools and weapons that underpinned early civilizations. These were the raw ingredients, but their true transformation happened when they were struck into coins. The invention of coinage, widely attributed to the Kingdom of Lydia in Asia Minor around the 7th century before the Common Era, was a revolution as profound as the invention of writing. Before coins, trade relied on barter or on weighing out bits of metal, a process that was slow, cumbersome, and required constant verification of purity. A coin changed everything. It was a compact, standardized unit of value, stamped with the emblem of a king or a city-state, which guaranteed its weight and purity. Imagine the sheer convenience. A Phoenician merchant selling purple dye in a Greek market no longer had to haggle over the weight and quality of a lump of silver. He could simply agree on a price in coins, confident that each little stamped disc contained a consistent amount of precious metal. This was the birth of true currency, and it supercharged commerce. It simplified transactions across language barriers and cultural divides, creating a common financial language that everyone, from an Egyptian farmer to a Persian satrap, could understand. Coins made trade faster, more efficient, and far more scalable, allowing for the complex, high-volume exchanges that defined the ancient global economy. But this interconnected financial system had a fascinating and sometimes dangerous side effect. It created the world's first experiences with globalized inflation and deflation. The flow of precious metals was not always steady. It came in great surges, and these surges could send economic shockwaves across thousands of miles. The most famous example is the massive influx of silver into the Roman economy from the conquered Spanish mines. As enormous quantities of new silver were minted into coins and spent by the state on armies and infrastructure, the basic laws of supply and demand took over. There was more money chasing the same amount of goods, so prices began to rise across the empire. A measure of wheat that cost a few coins in the time of Augustus might cost several times more a century later. This slow, steady devaluation of currency was a source of constant worry for Roman emperors and economists, who would sometimes try to debase the coinage by reducing its silver content, a short-term fix that only eroded public trust and often made the problem worse in the long run. Centuries later, the pattern repeated itself on an even more dramatic intercontinental scale. When the Spanish began looting the immense silver stocks of the Aztec and Inca empires in the 16th century, and then mining the phenomenal deposits at Potosi in modern Bolivia, they flooded the global market with unprecedented amounts of the metal. This silver was used to finance Spain's European wars and, crucially, to pay for the silks, porcelains, and spices of Asia. This huge injection of Spanish silver into the Chinese economy, which operated on a silver standard, caused a prolonged period of inflation there as well. The value of silver relative to goods dropped, meaning prices for everything from rice to land rose significantly. This was a clear demonstration of a truly globalized economy. The actions of Spanish conquistadors in the Andes were directly affecting the living costs of a peasant family in the Yangtze Delta. The system was exquisitely sensitive, a delicate financial balance where a discovery on one continent could tip the scales on another. For historians, some of the most poignant and revealing evidence of this metallic pulse comes not from grand imperial treasuries, but from the small, hidden hoards of coins buried by ordinary people and never recovered. Throughout Europe, the Middle East, and beyond, archaeologists and even farmers plowing their fields have unearthed these ancient savings. A clay pot filled with silver denarii buried under the floor of a Roman villa in Britain, hidden during a barbarian raid and never dug up by its owner. A leather pouch of gold solidi secreted in the wall of a house in a Syrian town, its owner likely lost to war or plague. These hoards are frozen moments of fear and hope. They are intimate snapshots of the monetary system in action, showing us which coins were in circulation, their condition, and what an individual considered a life-saving amount of wealth. By studying these hoards, we can trace the circulation of coinage, date the reigns of obscure rulers, and even map periods of instability, times when people felt so threatened that they chose to bury their life savings in the earth, a silent testament to the universal desire for security, a desire literally minted in metal. And this desire, this deep, almost primal lust for gold, was perhaps the most powerful driver of all. It was the glittering prize that motivated kings and explorers, fueling both magnificent achievements and horrific atrocities. The legendary wealth of Mansa Musa, the Emperor of Mali, was not an abstract concept. It was his famous pilgrimage to Mecca in the 1300s, where his caravan included thousands of attendants and carried so much gold that its lavish distribution in cities like Cairo actually caused a temporary depression in the value of the metal across the region. He put his empire on the map by literally throwing his money around. For the Spanish conquistadors, the stories of El Dorado, a mythical king covered in gold dust, were not just fables. They were a siren's call that drew them deep into the uncharted jungles of South America, leading to the conquest and devastation of entire civilizations. The quest for precious metals justified immense human suffering, from the slaves who died in the dusty mines of North Africa to the forced laborers in the terrifying, high-altitude silver mines of Potosi, a place the Spanish called the mountain that eats men. This relentless pursuit redrew the map of the world, funding the voyages that connected the Eastern and Western hemispheres and setting the stage for the modern era. In the end, the story of precious metals is the story of value itself, made tangible, portable, and perilous. It was a substance that could build empires and destroy them, that could connect continents in a web of finance and drive them apart in a frenzy of greed. These metals were not passive resources, they were active, transformative forces. In a world increasingly connected by trade, money, in its most elemental and glittering form, truly made the world go round. Picture a vast, sprawling trade network like the Silk Road. It's easy to focus on the grand in points the imperial courts of China and the bustling forums of Rome. But the real magic, the engine that made the entire system hum, wasn't found in these celebrated capitals. It thrived in the spaces in between, at the humble oasis towns, the treacherous river crossings, and the narrow mountain passes that served as the vital choke points of global commerce. These were the domains of the unsung heroes of ancient trade, the intermediaries and middlemen. While the great empires produced the goods and provided the ultimate demand, it was these often overlooked communities who truly wove the world together, mastering the delicate and often dangerous art of moving priceless cargo from one hand to the next. Their power came from a simple, unshakable fact of geography: a small settlement controlling a single, reliable water source in the middle of a blistering desert, like the oasis of Palmyra in Syria, held a power far greater than its size. Every caravan traveling between the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf had no choice but to stop there. The local leaders of Palmyra didn't just sell water and dates, they sold access. They provided armed escorts through bandit-infested territories, stored goods in secure warehouses, and negotiated safe passage deals with the surrounding nomadic tribes. In return, they levied taxes on every bale of silk, every sack of pepper that passed through their gates. They grew immensely wealthy not by producing anything themselves, but by becoming the indispensable toll booth on a global superhighway. Similarly, tribes controlling high mountain passes in the Pamir Mountains or the Alps held the keys to entire continents. They could charge exorbitant fees to guide caravans along the one viable path, or they could, with a single rockslide, sever a trade route for months. These intermediaries understood their leverage perfectly. Their entire economy was built on the simple, profitable reality of being in the way, the right way. The true currency of these middlemen, however, wasn't just their strategic location. It was their deep, intimate, and often secretive local knowledge. A merchant from Venice arriving at the port of Aden at the mouth of the Red Sea was a fish out of water. He didn't know the local dialects, the complex social customs, the hidden reefs in the harbor, or the right official to bribe to get his cargo inspected quickly. He was entirely dependent on a local intermediary. These brokers were multilingual, often speaking several languages common along the trade route. They knew the market conditions, when a glut of pepper was expected from India, or when demand for Chinese porcelain was spiking in Cairo. They understood the quality of goods, able to tell superior cinnamon from an inferior substitute with a single glance or sniff. They were the translators, not just of language, but of culture and commerce. They could introduce a foreign merchant to a reputable buyer, vouch for his character, and help draft a contract that was enforceable under local law. This service was invaluable. It reduced the immense risk for the long-distance trader, turning a potentially disastrous venture into a manageable business transaction. The broker's fee was not an expense, it was an investment in success, but this knowledge also gave the intermediaries their most powerful tool, the control of information. Secrecy was a cornerstone of their business model. A Phoenician merchant sailing to the tin mines of Cornwall in ancient Britain had no interest in telling his Greek competitors how to get there. He would guard the sea routes and navigational knowledge as a state secret. The same was true for the overland middlemen. They might buy silk from a caravan that had traveled from China, but when they sold it to a Persian merchant, they would be deliberately vague or even deceptive about its exact origin. By maintaining a fog of mystery around the source and the final market, they ensured that they remained the essential, irreplaceable link in the chain. If everyone knew where the spices actually grew or where the best markets were, why would anyone need a middleman? Their entire profitable existence depended on being the keepers of the map, the sole possessors of the logistical keys to the kingdom. Perhaps no civilization in the ancient world better exemplifies the art of the intermediary than the Phoenicians. Emerging from a narrow coastal strip in what is now Lebanon, the Phoenicians possessed very little arable land. They could never be an agricultural powerhouse like Egypt or a vast territorial empire like Assyria. So they turned to the sea and turned their weakness into their greatest strength. They became the master middlemen of the entire Mediterranean basin for centuries. Their strategy was breathtakingly simple and effective. They established a network of trading posts and colonies all along the coastlines, from Cyprus and Sicily to North Africa, and even as far as Spain. Their most famous colony, Carthage, would grow to rival Rome itself. At these outposts, the Phoenicians performed their commercial magic. From the resource-rich but less developed Western Mediterranean, they acquired vast quantities of silver from Spain, tin from Cornwall, and a unique, vivid purple dye made from the murex snail, a color so associated with royalty that it became known as Tyrian purple. They then transported these goods eastward to the sophisticated, luxury-hungry empires of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia. In return, they loaded their ships with finely crafted goods from the East, Egyptian papyrus, Mesopotamian textiles, and intricate glassware, and sold them at a massive markup to the chieftains and tribes of the West. The Phoenicians rarely conquered large swaths of inland territory. Their empire was a string of coastal cities, a network of nodes designed purely for trade. They were the ultimate go-betweens, connecting producers and consumers who often had no direct knowledge of each other. Their success was built on their unparalleled seamanship, their business acumen, and their ruthless protection of trade secrets. They were so effective that for a long time they were the only source for many of these goods, making them the indispensable wholesalers of the ancient world. The role of these intermediaries extended far beyond simple brokerage. They were the very glue that held fragile, long-distance networks together. Consider the immense trust required for trade over thousands of miles. A Chinese merchant selling a load of silk in Samarkand had to trust that the Sogdian middleman there would give him a fair price, or that the goods he received in exchange, perhaps glassware or lapis lazuli, were genuine. The Sogdian, in turn, had to trust that the Indian merchant he sold the silk to would pay as agreed. This chain of trust was the most fragile and valuable commodity of all. The intermediaries were the guarantors of this system. Their reputation for fairness and honesty was their most valuable asset. A trading hub that gained a reputation for cheating foreigners would quickly find its caravanserais empty and its markets silent. Conversely, a city known for its reliable weights, fair judges, and honest brokers, like the legendary Calicut on India's Malabar coast, would attract merchants from across the globe. The intermediaries also provided a layer of security and stability that individual travelers could not. They maintained relationships with local rulers and power brokers, paying tributes and taxes to ensure that trade could flow smoothly through their territory. They provided warehouse facilities where goods could be stored safely until the next leg of the journey, or until market conditions were more favorable. They smoothed out the inevitable friction of cross-cultural contact, preventing misunderstandings from escalating into conflicts that could shut down a route for years. In this sense, the success of the entire network, the flow of silk from China to Rome, the movement of spices from the Moluccas to Europe, did not ultimately depend on the emperor in Chang'an or the senator in Rome. It hinged on the countless, often nameless, intermediaries who operated in the spaces between. They were the shock absorbers for the global economy, the diplomats of commerce, and the unsung architects of a connected world, proving that the most crucial links in any chain are often the ones we see the least. But these sprawling networks of connection came with an invisible and often unintended price tag, one that was paid not in gold or silver, but in the very health of the planet itself. For the first time in human history, our economic ambitions began to reshape the environment on a continental scale, leaving a footprint that, in some places, is still visible today. Let's start with the most direct impact, the relentless harvesting of the very resources that fueled the trade. The legendary frankincense and myrrh routes of southern Arabia were built on a fragile ecological foundation. The scraggly boswellia and commiphora trees that produced these precious resins only grew in a very specific, arid climate, and they could not be rushed. Tapping them was a delicate art, requiring precise cuts and long periods of recovery. But as demand from Rome, India, and beyond skyrocketed, the pressure to produce more, faster, became immense. Historical evidence and modern studies suggest that this commercial overexploitation likely led to severe local environmental degradation. Entire groves of these slow-growing trees were probably tapped to exhaustion or cut down altogether, leading to soil erosion in the already fragile desert margins. When the protective root systems of these trees disappeared, the thin, life-sustaining topsoil would have been stripped away by wind and flash floods, transforming marginally productive land into barren desert. This wasn't just the depletion of a single species, it was the collapse of an entire micro-ecosystem that had supported local communities for generations. The land that gave the world its most sacred aromatics was, in a cruel irony, left scarred and impoverished by its own success, a powerful early example of an economy unsustainably consuming its natural capital. This pattern of resource extraction repeated itself across the ancient world, driven by the insatiable need for materials to build the engines of commerce. To construct the vast merchant fleets that plied the Mediterranean, the ships of the Phoenicians, Greeks, and Romans, an unimaginable number of trees had to fall. The great cedar forests of Lebanon, famed for their tall, straight, and rot-resistant timber, were the first to go. These magnificent trees were so prized for shipbuilding that they became a symbol of Phoenician power and a key resource fought over by empires. The Egyptian pharaohs sent massive expeditions to Lebanon for cedar, and the Romans continued the harvest for centuries. One of the primary demands for this timber was, ironically, to build the ships that would carry more resources, creating a vicious cycle of consumption. The same was true for the oak and fir forests of Italy, Greece, and other parts of the Mediterranean basin. As port cities grew into metropolises, the demand for wood expanded beyond shipbuilding to include fuel for heating, cooking, and industries like pottery kilns and metal smelting. The result was widespread and often irreversible deforestation. Hillsides that were once covered in dense, ancient forests were gradually stripped bare. This deforestation had cascading consequences that the ancients could not have fully foreseen. Without tree roots to hold the soil in place, rainfall would wash the fertile topsoil down into the valleys and out to sea, siltifying rivers and harbors. The famous port of Ephesus, for instance, is now miles from the coast, its harbor having filled with sediment from deforested hills. The loss of forest cover also altered local climates, making regions drier and more prone to erosion, and destroyed the habitats of countless plant and animal species. The very act of connecting the world by sea required the sacrifice of entire landscapes, turning lush, wooded coastlines into the rocky, sun-baked hills that characterize much of the Mediterranean today. Beyond the direct harvesting of resources, the physical presence of the trade routes themselves acted as a slow but constant force of environmental engineering. The ceaseless passage of hundreds of thousands of camels, horses, and oxen along the Silk Road and other caravan routes compacted the soil, creating hard, impermeable surfaces that prevented new plants from taking root. These well-worn paths acted like scars across the plains and deserts, concentrating erosion and altering drainage patterns. In mountainous regions, the need to create and maintain passes for trade led to the deliberate reshaping of the landscape, clearing rocks, building retaining walls, and in some cases, even carving narrow paths directly into cliff faces. The constant human and animal traffic also placed immense pressure on the delicate oasis ecosystems that served as lifelines in the desert. Sources of water that had sustained small, local communities for millennia were now being tapped to water enormous caravans of thousands of camels. The increased demand could lower water tables, drain springs, and introduce pollution from human and animal waste, degrading these vital hubs and making them less resilient for the people and wildlife that depended on them. The trade network, in its sheer scale and constant motion, was like a slow-moving glacier, grinding down the natural features it relied upon and permanently etching its path into the geology of the continents. Perhaps the most complex and unpredictable environmental impact, however, came from the trade in living things. The ancient world experienced its own, slower version of the Columbian exchange, as the ships and caravans became unwitting vectors for the global redistribution of plants and animals. Sometimes this was intentional. Traders carried saplings of valuable fruit trees, cuttings of grapevines, and seeds for new types of grain, hoping to establish them in new lands for profit or local consumption. But just as often, it was accidental. Rats, mice, insects, and weed seeds would stow away in sacks of grain, bales of cloth, or the nooks and crannies of ships. When these vessels made landfall, these opportunistic passengers would disembark into a new world, often with no natural predators to keep them in check. The black rat, for instance, is believed to have spread from India to the Near East and eventually throughout the Roman Empire via trade routes, where it thrived in granaries and urban centers. Beyond pests, the deliberate introduction of new species could have dramatic and unforeseen consequences. A new type of plant, brought from its native habitat where it was kept in balance by local insects, diseases, and competing flora, could suddenly find itself in a new environment where it faced no such constraints. It could then spread uncontrollably, choking out native plants, altering soil chemistry, and disrupting the food chain for local animals. While we have fewer detailed records than for the modern era, it is almost certain that ancient trade led to the establishment of invasive species that permanently altered local ecologies. A fast-growing ground cover from one continent might be introduced to another to control erosion on deforested hillsides, only to run rampant and smother the native seedlings that would have otherwise regenerated the forest. The global network designed to move goods became a chaotic and unregulated experiment in planetary biology, demonstrating that once you connect two ecosystems that evolved separately for millennia, the results are often unpredictable and irreversible. All of these individual stories, the stripped forests, the over-harvested groves, the compacted trails, and the traveling species, add up to a profound realization. The bustling, prosperous, interconnected world of antiquity was generating one of the first truly global environmental footprints. The choices made by a Roman consumer buying a bolt of Chinese silk or a jar of Arabian incense were causing ripples that affected soils, waters, and wildlife thousands of miles away. This was a powerful, early demonstration of a principle we are grappling with today, that no economy exists in a vacuum separate from the natural world that sustains it. The environment was not merely a passive backdrop for human history. It was an active participant, a resource that was utilized, a tool that was wielded, and far too often, a casualty that was damaged in the relentless pursuit of growth and connection. The legacy of these ancient networks reminds us that our relationship with the planet has always been a complex negotiation between our ambitions and the Earth's capacity to withstand them. Look at a modern map of the world's shipping lanes, those dense, glowing lines of traffic that converge on ports like Singapore, Rotterdam, and Shanghai. Now superimpose a map of the ancient spice routes and the monsoon-driven paths of the Arab dhows and Chinese junks. The overlap is not just a coincidence, it is a historical echo, a testament to the enduring power of geography and profit. The supertankers and container ships of the 21st century, carrying the lifeblood of our modern consumer economy, are sailing the very same aquatic highways that were first charted by intrepid mariners thousands of years ago, guided by the stars and the seasonal winds. They are just the latest, most efficient vessels in an unbroken chain of commerce that has never truly ceased. This is the most visible legacy of the ancient networks. The physical and economic geography they established has proven to be remarkably persistent. The same strategic straits that were fought over by the Srivijaya Empire and the Portuguese Malacca, Hormuz, the Bosporus remain the critical choke points of global trade today, where a single incident can send shockwaves through the world economy. The economic dominance of certain regions is also a profound echo of the past. For centuries, China was the manufacturing superpower of the world, producing the silks, porcelain, and luxuries that everyone else desired, creating a massive trade surplus that drained silver from the West. After a period of historical divergence, China has once again reclaimed its position as the workshop of the world, a resurgence that can feel less like a new phenomenon and more like a return to a very old, deeply embedded pattern. Similarly, the cities that thrived as hubs, then Constantinople, now Istanbul, ancient trading posts in the Gulf, continue to be centers of finance and logistics now, their importance cemented not by a temporary boom, but by the permanent logic of their location at the crossroads of continents. This legacy, however, is far more profound than just shipping routes and urban geography. The very concept of a globally interconnected economy, which we often attribute to the late 20th century, was in fact born not in a corporate boardroom or a tech startup, but in the dusty, vibrant bazaars and harbors of antiquity. The fundamental principles that underpin our modern financial system were all pioneered on these ancient pathways. The entire idea of a supply chain where raw materials are sourced from one region, manufactured in another, and sold to consumers in a third, was being practiced on a transcontinental scale along the Silk Road. A single bolt of silk represented a complex, multi-stage production process. Silkworms cultivated in China, raw silk transported to workshops in Persia for dyeing with rare pigments from India, and then woven into patterns that might incorporate Hellenistic or Roman motifs before being sold to a wealthy Roman patrician. This was globalization in slow motion, but it was globalization nonetheless. The financial instruments we take for granted have equally ancient roots. The bill of exchange used by a medieval Italian merchant to avoid carrying sacks of gold, a system known as hawala in the Islamic world, is the direct ancestor of the modern letter of credit and international bank transfer. It was a system built on trust and networks, separating the concept of value from its physical form, a revolutionary idea that allowed capital to flow faster and more safely than goods ever could. The ancient world even grappled with the side effects of globalization that feel intensely familiar to us today. The Romans worried about the loss of domestic manufacturing and the drain of their silver and gold to foreign powers to pay for Eastern luxuries, a classic trade deficit concern. The price inflation caused by the flood of Spanish silver into Ming China is a perfect historical example of how a monetary shock in one part of the globe can trigger economic instability in another, a phenomenon we see play out in our own interconnected markets daily. The challenges of product authenticity and branding existed then, too, with laws in Rome attempting to regulate the quality of imported silk and prevent fraud. The blueprint for our entire global economic order, with all its dazzling opportunities and its intractable problems, was drafted not in the last 50 years, but in the first millennia of cross-cultural exchange. Perhaps the most vibrant and personal legacy of these ancient networks is the rich tapestry of cultural blending that defines our modern cities. Walk through the streets of London, New York, or Toronto, and you will hear a symphony of languages, smell the aromas of 100 different cuisines, and see a fusion of fashion and art from every corner of the planet. This is not a sudden development of the Jet Age. It is the accelerated continuation of a process that began millennia ago in places like the caravanserais of the Silk Road, the port of Calicut, or the markets of Baghdad. These ancient hubs were the original melting pots where a Sogdian merchant, a Chinese official, and a Persian artisan would meet, trade, and inevitably share more than just goods. They shared stories, recipes, musical scales, and artistic techniques. They intermarried, learned each other's languages, and created new hybrid identities. The modern cosmopolitan citizen, comfortable in multiple cultures, is the direct descendant of those multilingual, adaptable traders who saw the world not as a collection of isolated tribes, but as a network of potential connections. Our global cuisine is the most delicious evidence of this. The tomato, a staple of Italian cooking, originated in the Americas. The chili pepper, essential to Thai and Indian curries, also came from the New World. But the spices that define those curries, cumin, coriander, turmeric, have been traveling across Asia for thousands of years. The very act of sitting down to a meal is a historical experience, a tasting menu of ancient trade routes. This cultural fusion is now so deeply embedded in our identities that we rarely stop to consider its origins. The mathematical and scientific knowledge that forms the basis of our modern world, from the Arabic numerals we use to the astronomical observations of many cultures, is itself a product of this ancient cross-pollination, a collective human inheritance gathered from countless sources along these trade highways. Ultimately, to understand the powerful, often overwhelming, forces of globalization that shape our lives today, the flow of capital, the migration of people, the spread of technology, and the clash and blend of cultures, we must look back. The sense of a rapidly shrinking world, connected by instant communication and rapid transportation, can feel disorienting and new, but the underlying human impulses that drive it are ancient. The desire for a better life, for new experiences, for exotic goods, and for profitable exchange is what first motivated those early traders to risk everything and venture into the unknown. The tensions we see today between globalism and localism, between open borders and protectionism, are modern manifestations of age-old struggles over who benefits from these connections and who gets left behind. The ancient networks show us that globalization is not a single, linear process but a series of pulses, with periods of intense connection, like the Pax Mongolica, followed by periods of contraction and fragmentation, like the collapse of the Roman Empire that disrupted the Western trade routes. Our current era of hyper-globalization is one such pulse, albeit the fastest and most extensive in history. By studying these ancient patterns, we gain a crucial sense of perspective. We see that the world has been connected before, that interdependence is not a modern invention, and that the challenges and opportunities it presents are part of a much longer human story. We are not living in a completely unprecedented time, but rather in the latest chapter of a grand historical narrative. The long shadow of those hidden pathways, the Silk Road, the Spice Routes, the Amber Road, and all the others, falls directly upon us, shaping our economies, our cultures, and our very understanding of the world. Our modern, hyper-connected existence is not built on a blank slate. It is constructed on these ancient, powerful, and deeply human foundations. So when we trace the line from that first piece of obsidian, passed from one hand to another in a gesture of mutual need, to the vast and humming digital networks of our own time, we see a story not of separate events, but of a single, unbroken thread. These ancient trade networks were far more than just economic systems. They were the true, unseen architects of human destiny. They laid the very groundwork upon which our modern world is built. They connected continents long before satellites mapped them, creating dialogues between empires that had no idea the other existed. They acted as the world's first and most effective melting pots, fusing cultures, languages, and artistic traditions in the bustling caravanserais and port cities, creating new and vibrant hybrid identities out of what was once separate. They were the primary vector for the spread of revolutionary technologies, carrying the seeds of progress, like paper, gunpowder, and the compass, from their points of origin to every corner of the globe where they could be adapted, improved, and set loose to change the world all over again. And in doing all this, they built the first genuine global economy, a complex and deeply interdependent system where the price of pepper in Rome could be affected by a monsoon in India, and where the silver mines of Bolivia could influence the economy of Ming Dynasty China. This was a level of connection we often arrogantly assume is unique to our own era. But this legacy is not a simple, triumphant march of progress. It is a dual inheritance, a story of light and shadow that we are still learning to navigate today. These same pathways that carried silk and spices also carried the Black Death, devastating populations across continents. The same economic engines that built magnificent cities like Petra and Timbuktu were often powered by the brutal institution of slavery and fueled countless wars over control of lucrative routes. The very connections that enriched the world also made it uniquely vulnerable to exploitation and pandemic, a complex reality that forces us to acknowledge that our global village was born with these profound challenges already woven into its fabric. When we look out at our own interconnected modern world with its container ships, fiber optic cables, and instantaneous financial markets, we are not witnessing some brand new, unprecedented phenomenon. We are seeing the latest, fastest, and most intense chapter in a story that began thousands of years ago with a single footstep on a desert path. This perspective is humbling and empowering. The next time you casually grind black pepper onto your meal, that simple act connects you directly to the Indian farmers who grew it, the ancient Arab and Venetian merchants who fought to control it, and the European explorers who braved uncharted oceans to find its source. When you read a book, you are benefiting from the journey of papermaking from China through the Islamic world and into the libraries of Europe. When you use the number 0 in a calculation, you are tapping into a mathematical concept that traveled from India to Baghdad and beyond, carried on the same routes that transported spices and gems. These everyday objects are not just things, they are repositories of history, each one a silent witness to an epic journey of human connection. Let this knowledge settle in. Let it change the way you see the world around you. Let it inspire a deeper curiosity about the hidden pathways, both ancient and modern, that bind us all together, making strangers into partners and the vast expanse of our planet into a shared home. We would love to hear which part of this story resonates most with you. Was it the golden allure of amber, the sacred scent of frankincense, or the world-altering power of a single peppercorn? Share in the comments which ancient trade good you find most fascinating, and let's continue this conversation about the deep roots of our